Muy buenos días, vamos a dar comienzo.
Good morning. We will be starting this session about climate change from the perspective of the scientific community, as well as the response from public, national, international institutions. First of all, I would like to personally thank Ana Barreira, the director of the Instituto Internacional de Derecho y Medio Ambiente, for the organization of this session, and to all our audience here, the speakers and who were coming from abroad. Thank you so much for participating in this session. I would be remiss to start the speech without acknowledging the role of the International Institute for Law and the Environment for their participation. We have Ana Barreiro with a large background in international and national affairs. She has been acknowledged in several occasions. I would also like to remind you of an award that she received in the name of her team concerning a project to analyze the compatibility of the deployment of renewable energies with the conservation or preservation of biodiversity and the interests of local communities, grassroots communities. One of the many issues that we will be mentioning here. This is very important for us in terms of ecological transition and demographic challenge. And here I would like to thank the director, Valvanera Ulargui, which is from the Spanish Climate Change Office. Her main task is to follow up the development of negotiations at the European and international level, of course, and being able to embed and enforce commitments of our country in terms of climate change. Without further ado, I give the floor to the organizer of this session, Ana Barreira, and then later on, I will have the occasion of conveying a few thoughts on my part. Welcome. Welcome as president of Commission for the Ecological Transition and Demographic Challenge in the House of Commons. Thank you. Thank you so much, Christina, for your very kind words of introduction to me and to all the international team. The International Institute for Law and the Environment. We will be tackling the role of science and the response of political and public institutions to climate change. I would like to thank Cristina Narbona. She is the president of the Commission for Ecological Transition and Demographic Challenge for all of her support to be able to have this session here today, hold this session in the House that represents popular sovereignty. In our International Institute for Law and the Environment, founded in the year 1997, we contribute to the protection of the Earth system and environment and contribute to the sustainable development through studying, analyzing, and applying law. Yet at the same time, we have been witness and we acknowledge how science and economics play a fundamental role in the response of the international community to tackle and face the degradation of the planet. And this response is shaped through instruments that are called hard and soft law, that is, international conventions and enforcement instruments. And in fact, I would like to give you an example of how the role of the scientific community is so important and how it's been a true booster. For instance, in the 70s, we published the first analysis of the scientific community concerning the dynamics of destruction of the ozone layers. So many chemicals were destroying this layer, and they were pointing out the possibility of what would happen truly. And Mario Molina was a Mexican scientist that boosted this kind of effort and later on went on to win a Nobel Prize. And so we had the Vienna Conference in the 70s, and then in 87 and 88, the Montreal Protocol. There are a few examples of how law can intervene in this interrelationship. This has been the first example of applying the principle of precaution, because at the time, we weren't sure absolutely in scientific terms. The same thing has happened with climate change. In the year 88, we created the Intergovernmental Panel of Experts on Climate Change. And in the 90s, they published their first report, the first assessment report that gave way to the creation of the Intergovernmental Convention for the UN Convention on Climate Change. When we created the General Assembly, a resolution of the National Assembly of the UN, thanks to this report, we could acknowledge all the significance of the IPCC, of the International Institute for Law and the Environment. And this has been true through the entire development of the international response against climate change. When we adopted the Kyoto Protocol, we had also published the second report. And then after the Paris agreements, we had just published another very, very important report. This has been incredibly important, not only at the international level, but also at the regional, continental level, and at the national levels. We started creating similar institutions to the IPCC, and we will be talking about this today in a few of the panels. In the International Institute for Law and Environment, we have spent several years, since 2018, we started working on the role of science in the fight against climate change. We have given you a few reports with the program itself. For instance, this report was published just before COVID, and we analyzed bodies, scientific assessment bodies in the UK, France, and we also analyzed the framework of the public institutions in Spain to try and, well, truly enforce or create a similar body here in Spain. Because of all of these efforts, we have organized this conference about the climate goals for 2040 and climate targets for 2040. We are now seeing the effects that the first report of assessment of the IPCC was overseeing. We must implement all of the measures adopted by the international scientific community. We must also work to have a new target for 2040, because soon, next year, we will need to have the new contributions determined nationally in the UN Secretariat. With this brief introduction, I would like to give the floor to the Director of the Spanish Climate Change Office, Valvanera Ulargui. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Anna. Thank you, Christina, for inviting me to participate in this session, which is absolutely paramount. And Anna has framed it perfectly. We are at the doors of the European elections, and it is an absolutely critical point as Spanish citizens and also as citizens of the European Union. Why is it such a significant moment? Right now, we must continue to build everything that we have done until now. I see many familiar faces here that have played a crucial role in the battle against climate change. from their own perspectives, from the administration, at the lead of ministries, institutions, companies, and the time has come to continue to build together this agenda. Yes, we have done many things in 20 years. We have advanced incredibly. All of the climate knowledge that has been created has helped the agenda to be a well-being agenda. We can have to continue fighting and struggling. And why? Why is it a well-being agenda? Because it is preventing the worst consequences of climate change. The cost to the citizenship, to private companies and public companies, we can see the consequences in all territories. It's even coming sooner than all scientific projections. And why? Because it is a competency agenda. It is an agenda that takes into account the companies. We are thinking about green technologies. We are bolstering them because they are so significant for Europe and for our companies. What are we seeing? What are we receiving on the part of science? As Anna was saying, I believe all the significant decisions of international climate summits have had an IPCC report that has truly approved their results and bolstered them to go beyond. And we're not only talking about the political sphere, we're also talking about, well, all of the other spheres. In the Kyoto Protocol, we remember that we were in a small hotels in Germany, and right now we need really large cities and a green zone where all civil society can truly participate, because civil society is already a part of the action that we are mobilizing against climate change. What have we observed recently? It is truly a tragedy to say so. I hadn't thought I would be mentioning this, but we must do so because IMED has truly published the state of the climate recently. 2023 has been an extremely hot year in our country. Of course, it comes through the trend that we are seeing in the rest of the planet, bolstered by climate change. No doubt it is because the greenhouse emissions have increased, a record of a number in hot days. So 9 months more that would be expected. We have not registered any cold days, record cold days. This is the first day in history in our country since we have had data. The spring has been the second most driest one. And truly, all of these trends have continued in 2023. We have had a long-lasting dry trend, and it has a huge economic and social impact for the population. These are data observed. They are not projections. They are not speculations. We could not say, oh, some studies say no. We have observed so much data that ignoring them would be absolutely irresponsible on the part of administrators, on the part of public policy. And on the other hand, what we must do is to bring solutions on the table. This is our responsibility on the part of the public policy of the government. The EU, is not far behind. We have assessed the risk impact a month ago. We have published 30 catastrophic risks, or at least 30 risks, and most of them catastrophic. So we cannot afford to stop our efforts. We must bolster a just climate action because we are more vulnerable. We are heating up 3 times faster in Europe than the rest of the planet, and so we cannot hide these data. We truly must implement measures good for all citizens in all sectors. How are we doing this? We have a vocation to bring service in climate policy. And very sadly, all of this is of impact for us, everyone in our country. all economic sectors can be truly impacted positively by these policies. We have had boosts in the latest governments, and so we have had good results in renewables and energy technology. We also have to think about farmers. They need fertile soil, they need rainfall to ensure the subsistence of all citizens. The tourism sector is very important for Spain. As the Central European Bank has said, it is one of the most affected spheres, and truly, our industry has to fight for the tourism sector. There is a geopolitical battle between China and the United States that must not forget the EU. We need levers that help us to keep the industry on the path of green services, green infrastructures, green policy, with all the values always defended by the EU. It is a policy of economic security.
Es mucho mayor que el coste de actuar a favor del cambio climático.
Concerning climate impacts, but it's also a competitive security and economic security policy. So we must open our focus concerning the climate change policies. We also must be able to increase our focus so that this policy can not only be seen as an environmental one, but especially progress, development, equity, and competitiveness. Cohesion is so important and will be in the next commission. We had a report in the EU that says that the impacts are as asymmetric. They are not seen in all of the regions of Europe in the same way. The more vulnerable the regions, the more vulnerable the countries, the cohesion funds will need to help them more. These are finite funds, and so we must channel them towards where they can have more value. What did the EU do? As we were saying, we have new targets for 2040. We have the EU in the report that was published in February after the summits of the climate summits, which you knew that we had a global stop take in Dubai to understand where countries were in terms of emissions and where we will be in the next few years, introduced a target 90%, but we did introduce the three possible scenarios. So we recommended 90% because it is a target that is in line with point number 5, in line with science, and can help Europe advance in just transition policies. This objective will help to reach the Dubai summit. 90% reduction in fossil fuels for decarbonization and fully decarbonizing electricity. This also means co-benefits of savings in the amounts that we are channeling right now to fossil fuels. These are savings of $2.8 trillion. These are estimates made by the commissions that could be channeled back to policies of climate change and renewables. In this line, we can be helped to be leaders in international organizations and meetings. It's so important this year because we want to introduce our new goals for 2035. And we can advance, we can influence in the G20, which represents over 80% of emissions, and we can be the first to introduce the maximum ambition following scientific data. This is why the recommendation of the Commission of 90% is so good in 2040. This 90% can be understood as a follow-up, as a path that has been designed after Fit for 55. But we can bolster and help these sectors that can need more help always. This can be a positive debate with this number, 90%. This debate should not be seen as new loads, new burdens for sectors to broaden this ambition on the backs of those that have it more difficult. At the contrary, what we are defining in Spain and our candidate for the elections, we want to show that this green agenda is a positive agenda, which will create more progress and a better position of the EU in the world. We will not waste our scarce resources. We will be coherent in channeling public funds. This will be positive for industry, for companies in terms of employment, of growth, because the data are positive. If we are capable of following up with proper public policies. We also have green technologies. This will be good. We will reach $650 billion until 2030. We mean 7 years of positive scenarios in which we have to work hand in hand to leverage this opportunity. And we will also reduce the judicial impacts and legal impacts that we are seeing at the EU overall. We must also avoid frozen assets, truly, and we need to use our assets. Our public policy has to be coherent with 1.5%, but we need to use taxonomies and avoiding truly not using assets for public and private budgets. I know that 90% can be a very scary number. This is why we need to budget for new political dialogues and communication, to have follow-up policies with frameworks, financial frameworks, and communication with the financial system. We have been in the ministry councils in Brussels to have our first discussions on the 90% number. The social aspect must be at the core of our agenda. We are seeing vulnerable people vulnerable to climate change, and so we need and absolutely need a social policy to help most vulnerable people to truly see the benefits of green policies. We must also be able to have these green products, heat pumps, solar plex. We must also consider citizens, SMEs, and put on the table, we must be able to put on the table a policy that facilitates access to all products and green services, such as the next generation funds. And we must channel financial frameworks to adapt them to this 90% target. We know that we are not there yet. We have done a good job with the next generation funds, but the grand generation funds must be the day in, day out practice that we have to apply. And this is key to identify all of our needs, rehabilitation needs, transport needs, etc. This means that our financial framework and impact must be 100% green. It cannot go against our green policies. And our budgets, our public budgets, must be green. Of our Spanish budgets, and the member states' budgets. Of course, we have a long way to go in Spain. We're talking about more public funds, but where should we channel it to leverage and create the needed investments? The role of the European Investment Fund is absolutely paramount to accelerate all of the implementation of the climate agenda. It must continue with its policies of Green Bank, which was bolstered a few years ago, but it needs to introduce new instruments, differentiated instruments to integrate both components we were mentioning, green policy, social benefit, that could favor just transition. Last but not least, we have the third pillar, which is the social focus of the transition policies, rechanneling financing to get a new strengthened social policy. We are not starting from scratch. We have the industrial net zero, which is very positive, and gears investments and European technologies. But we need cheap energy. We need to limit being dependent on third parties, and we need to create new alliances with countries that are competing in global markets. The first step is to implement Fit for 55. We are very aware. We know that long-term signals generate investments truly, and this 90% goes in line with the new package we have introduced. The challenge is to implement all of the legislation of Fit for 55. How must we do this then? We need to follow up with the sectors that are hardest to decarbonize. Of course, for them it's harder, and we need to follow up and help SMEs. Of course, in Spain, there are its whole important ecosystem, and so they will have a harder time getting to training, and we have to be able to direct actions for green products, to steer their actions, understand which kind of carbon footprint the SMEs have so that we help them become greener and access key policies in these years. We need to work with our European partners in a different way. In terms of SMEs, we need to create expert clusters. This is also a very positive policy that we want to bolster from the Spanish government, and always led by a certain taxonomy, indicators that are coherent and that help us measure where the integration of carbon price is in every single industrial arena. How are we going to do this? We need to open public dialogues. This is true. All the framework that we have implemented has meant speed. And sometimes we lack time to truly explain how we're going to deploy this. I will be brief. I believe that this is a fundamental responsibility of all of us. This is no time to think or go back on our steps. We must dedicate time to explain the benefits of this agenda and truly implement the proper tools for SMEs and for all sectors of society. We need to bet on science. We need to bet on national, European scientific committees and IPCC, because they have warned us about what happened, of what will happen, but they are also bringing solutions. And here we know that technologies exist. Some are more cost effective than others, but we need to understand where we need to work more. We need to prove the efficiency of electric vehicles, of storage networks, and all technologies needed for the decarbonization. And lastly, let's not follow disinformation or misinformation and fake news. We must truly follow information given by science, truly with language understood by citizens. This will be so important so that these elections are successful elections for Europe, where the Green Deal 2.0 is bolstered and focuses on society, so needed for this agenda that is positive for all. Thank you.
Pues muchísimas gracias, Valvanera. Y vamos a dar paso a la primera sesión para abordar la cuestión del establecimiento de un objetivo para el año 2040 y la respuesta científica a la emergencia climática. Entonces, por favor, Jean-Françoise, Soussana y José Manuel Gutiérrez, por favor, suban. Muchísimas gracias. Gracias. Muy bien, pues como comentaba en mi introducción,
Well, as I was saying in my introduction, I recall that the IPCC has gradually been revealing the situation of the climate system, which is the ultimate goal that the United Nations Framework Agreement wishes to protect in terms of climate change. The IPCC's role has been crucial in providing this international response, also at the regional and national levels. But together with the IPCC, there have been a series of movements over the past decade, and work has begun in constituting scientific advisory boards on the climate issue in many countries. And the first example was found in the United Kingdom with the 2008 Climate Change Act, created by the Climate Change Committee, which was in fact one of the committees we analysed in the report, and which has a wealthy background and has been very significant in many of the decisions that have been made in terms of policies in the United Kingdom. After this committee, several other committees emerged following this model, and within the European Union level, there are several countries that have these type of scientific advisory boards. There is an example in Germany, which created a climate change expert panel in the federal climate change law in 2019. Denmark created its Danish climate change committee based on its law in 2014. And today we will have with us, not face to face, he's in Denmark, but we will have one of the representatives of this board. From France, we have Jean-Françoise Soussana. France also established, based on a presidential decree in 2019, that bolsters the law, the climate and energy law of that very same year, the High Council for the Climate, and so did the Netherlands in 2023. Ireland created it in 2015. Their Climate Change Advisory Board is also functioning, and Sweden established it in 2017 within the framework of their climate change policy. There are very many more, but these are the ones that I really wanted to highlight in the European Union. In Australia, for instance, they have the Climate Change Authority, and in Chile, they have a Climate Change Scientific Advisory Committee too. The European Climate Act from 2021 created the European Scientific Advisory Board on Climate Change, to which Jean-Françoise Soussana also belongs. And at the moment, many of these advisory boards are working to establish this target for 2040, which will then also have to be underpinned with a series of measures and public policies, and naturally we will also have to involve the private sector. These measures will have to be applied as from the year 2031 if we are to achieve these targets and these goals for 2040. As Valvanera was already mentioning in her presentation earlier, looking ahead at our goals for 2040, we have to begin applying measures now that we have currently available. And those measures, in implementing them, a crucial role is also played by this type of scientific advisory boards, because their functions include following up the implementation of all of these policies. They are required to draw up annual reports, and in many cases, in several countries, there is also the figure of so-called carbon budgets included in all of their legal frameworks, which require follow-up too. And also, next year, in accordance with the Glasgow COP agreements, there will be common timeframes that have established that by 2025, these new targets will have to be presented for these national committees. Within all of this context, and in order to tackle these matters, I have with me on this table now, firstly, José Manuel Gutiérrez, who is PhD in mathematics and also belongs to the CSIC and the Institute of Physics of Cantabria. And he has a wealth of experience in researching climate change and artificial intelligence. He is with us today because he is also a member of the Intergovernmental Climate Change Panel of the United Nations. And he also was the main author and coordinator of the 6th evaluation report, and he is a member of the IPCC Working Data Group. He has taken part in a great many IPCC activities concerning science for policies and for communication. For instance, having attended COP25 and COP26, where they presented all of the work that they've been doing. We also have with us, as I already mentioned, Jean-Françoise Soussana, who since March 2017 is Vice President of International Policy from the International Institute for Agriculture, Food and the Environment in Paris, France. He has a PhD in plant physiology and was appointed a member of this institute. He has been the director of the Ecosystem Laboratory from the year 2000 to 2009, and also scientific director for the environment of this very same institution. He is a member of the IPCC since 1998, and he has contributed as the key author to many of the reports of these assessment reports that we have been mentioning. And he is also with us today because he is a member of the High Council for Climate Change of France and of the Scientific Advisory Board for the European Union on Climate Change. So he has a very wealthy background, a long career behind him, and today he is going to be sharing with us his experience as a member of these two key advisory bodies, both at the European Union level and the national level in France. And also we will have with us Peter Møllgaard, who will be joining us online. He is a president of the Danish Council on Climate Change and president of the Copenhagen Business School. He has a wealthy background in integrating renewable energies in the electric grid and in investigating regulations and policies in the field of competition. So without further ado, José Manuel, you now have the floor to talk to us all about your long career in the IPCC and all their work and how this has impacted policies. Thank you so much.
Buenos días. Muchas gracias, Cristina y Ana, por
Good
invitarme.
morning. Thank you, Cristina. Anna, it is a pleasure to be here with all of you. And I'm going to try and say things as straightforwardly as possible about the process that is followed by IPCC in drawing up reports. This is going to give you a first-hand idea of what we do and what major lines are followed to ensure that these reports provide an efficient baseline to shape policies from the scientific point of view.
Como ya comentaron antes, el IPCC se
As
fundó
mentioned earlier, the IPCC was founded in 1988 by the United Nations, broadly speaking. It is a body that was established to organize report assessments that would seek to investigate climate change. The IPCC has a secretariat with the General Secretary and other members, and it is structured based on 4 work groups linked to the content of these reports. The goal of these reports is to assess the situation of climate from a physical point of view, to understand the parameters that we're dealing with, what makes it different from the past, and how we can move forward to the present, depending on the various social economic scenarios that we are experiencing.
Trabajo 2 estudia el impacto del
That
cambio
would be
climático.
work group 1. Work group 2 studies the impact of climate change on different aspects such as biodiversity, health, agriculture from a comprehensive point of view. And work group 3 studies how to mitigate climate change and the effect of greenhouse gases on the climate. And it also seeks to understand what concentrations of gases there are and what pathways we have to reduce emissions in order to meet a series of goals depending on the heat targets that we set ourselves for the future. These IPCC reports talk about heating levels as a parameter to communicate information efficiently. We're talking about whether we're going to heat up 1.5 degrees, 1 degree under the Paris Agreement. There are harmful substances, or whether we're going to be looking at 2, 3, or 4 degrees. These are parameters that are used in order to convey a purely scientific message in the more straightforward terms that can be used to shape effective policies. And that is the role of the IPCC. We have a series of authors. We are the basis of everything.
Forma en cada ciclo del IPCC. Hemos terminado el
And
sexto.
we've just finished the 6th cycle of the IPCC, and we're entering the 7th cycle with an integrating and open system. The authors are selected in each of these cycles to ensure that they are geographically diverse and essentially diverse in many different ways in order to integrate all of the standpoints, all of the values that naturally affect this topic. Ultimately, what is drawn up, as you can see in the last report, are very lengthy reports. The 6th one, Chapter 1, which is my chapter with the scientific basis, contains thousands of pages with thousands of graphs and charts. It is completely impossible for any normal person that might be sitting in this room to tackle all of that information, which is why the IPCC seeks to improve, to refine, to narrow down its processes so that the information can be conveyed as simply as possible. And therefore, there are policymakers that have a short executive summary, and there the idea is to be as brief as possible so that out of these thousands of pages, things can be specified into just 15, 20 pages containing the most relevant information that can actually be used. That's the final executive report, which is what is most valuable for decision making for policymakers. The IPCC then reports to the Framework Convention of the United Nations, and they are the ones who commission the IPCC Secretariat to draw up its reports on a regular basis. At the moment, we are currently generating the 6th report under the Framework Convention, where there is a meeting to establish what they want to be included in the report. Not what results they want to see, but what processes and what topics are particularly interesting for the IPCC to consider. And there is a general report, and then they need to produce special issues based on that report. For instance, there is a special report in Cycle 7 on cities and climate change. So apart from the report itself, there are these special issues that are written up. Therefore, regularly in the media, you will be seeing there is a report by the IPCC on land use, on oceans, on this 1.5 degree heating, and then there is the full comprehensive report. So what are the principles of the IPCC report? This is written into the DNA of all of us, all of the people who take part in the IPCC. We are educated to do this, and really people highlight the importance of this. Firstly, we assess, okay? We don't make science. The 300 plus authors do not write the science. Of course, we publish articles, papers, and that's part of the corpus of the literature. But what I do is read all of the articles, the papers that are sent to me, and I have coordinated one of the chapters in the latest report, which is the Regional Atlas on Climate Change. And what I do is that together with the group of authors that have been allocated to that chapter, which were 12 in this case, we, for instance, are divided into continents, some focus on Africa, some on Europe, and we check through all of the scientific literature on climate change since the last report, talking about a given topic. So there are thousands of papers and articles, and what we do is we synthesize it. There is therefore a consensus that Europe is a hot spot. There is a consensus that Europe has improved in the past few years, and we need to establish whether or not there are these agreements or not. The report does not make science, therefore it does not share opinions either. We merely convey the science. And the principles of the IPCC are neutral because they are based on science. Science that is placed at the disposal of a certain degree, a certain variety of interests. There is no other hidden message in the reports. They are politically neutral. They are respectful of all values. There's no mixtures. There's nothing else there because there is no political bias in science. There is no ideology or political values. So when you read a paper, the science behind it is not biased. Then, of course, there may be interests behind the publication, but the science itself is not biased. There is scientific evidence, and that is what we use, that is what we take into account. So it's very important that you understand that you will not find any guidelines. You will not find a report saying this is what must be done or that is what must be done. It does, however, say this is the path we should be following if we wish to achieve this goal, but it is not prescriptive. And that's something I really wanted to highlight because it's important. And all 356 members of the work group are fully aware of this, and this is the path that we follow. Anna already mentioned that we are now on the 6th report. It started in 2015. We've finally published that 6th report. I've been doing this for 6 years, and I think I still have a bit of drive left. And Anna was saying that these reports are aligned with the Kyoto Protocol, the Paris Agreement, and so on. And in these framework conventions, the IPCC plays a role in the sense that it provides information for decisions to be made based on the evidence. In this 6th report, 3 of these special issues that I was mentioning earlier have been produced, and then there have been reports for each of the different chapters. Work group 1, 2, 3, there are thousands of pages. And then we have, as I was saying, these executive summaries that are available to society at large. This here is also important. Why does it take 6 years to draw up a report? The process is long, it contains many stages, and most importantly, there is a process of drawing up drafts that then undergo open evaluations on behalf of the scientific community. So any scientist around the world, or anyone who has, let's say, a certain criteria to assess the content of the report, can access it at a given point when it is at the draft stage, and they can share whatever they consider is right or wrong in that draft. Then their comments have to be taken into account and they have to be responded objectively. There is a special figure in the IPCC, which is the review editor, who, well, in fact, there are 2 people, and their sole purpose in the process is to ensure that the comments that are submitted in these 2 review processes, to ensure that the comments are answered correctly and that they are correctly reflected inside the report. So if anyone says, you're overlooking this paper, you've forgotten, and if you're not taking into account this paper, things are not right, then this has to be included. We cannot overlook any of the work because these editors, these reviewers, will tell you what they think is right or wrong. That means we have to be extremely thorough in terms of the content of the report, and everyone is able to share their opinion and make comments as they see fit. That's why the process is so long and it contains several stages. So now looking at the numbers, as I was saying earlier, in my work group, these are all of the people that were present in the first meeting that was held in China. There were 234 authors for the first work group. There are others for the second group, which is impact, and the third group, which is mitigation, and so on. Out of 60, they came from 65 countries, and 30% of them were new. 70% had already taken part in previous editions, in previous reports, and they provide a bit of a legacy and a bit of guidance in what can and cannot be done. We analysed 14,000 publications, so all of the publications in scientific literature linked to climate change since the past report. So that's over the past 8 years. We've analysed them one by one, and based on that, we have produced our reports with 78,000 plus review comments. 78,000. That means that in my chapter, for instance, we had 3,500 comments. And we had to answer each of them individually, one by one. That means months and months of work in every stage. Each of these comments may be trivial, or they may require some very thorough research and investigation, new calculations, and all of this involves a lot of hard work. Then an event is held in which the report is approved once all of this work has been done, and the executive summary is approved in this framework convention by the governments. The changes are read line by line. Recent changes in climate are generalized, fast, and more intense, and they are unprecedented over the past thousands of years. That is, let's say, the main takeaway from this past meeting. So if any countries then have a final reflection on this sentence, they would subject that to debate, and then the sentence would be approved or not. So every single line, every single element of wording in the report is subjected to debate. And that's a crucial moment when the countries make the report their very own. That's the time when the countries can argue, always based on science, of course. Whoever comes to the event to debate has to belong to technical and scientific delegations. The country can't just stand up and say, I don't like this sentence, remove it because it doesn't suit me. That's not the kind of comments that are accepted. But they can specify, let's say, the nuances, because a word may have a certain load or a certain significance that they would prefer to be replaced by another scientific term. But it's always, as I was saying, based on science. These data, which are collected in the report, have been fueled by the scientific literature in 14,000 publications that provide mass evidence. Mass evidence means that pretty much all of them are pointing in the right direction. So there are no considerable studies that suggest the opposite idea. It means that there's no evidence in the whole corpus that could lead us to think otherwise. Therefore, every statement is allocated a degree of confidence, highly likely, likely, improbable, and this is then taken as the scientific basis. This is all backed also by data, which show us, for instance, this graph shows us the average temperature on the planet and how it has evolved since 1950 to the present day. The baseline is 0, which at the pre-industrial era, when human activity had not yet altered the chemical composition of the atmosphere too significantly. It was about 300 particles per million, and now we're looking at 400 plus. So this graph may seem quite inoffensive, quite harmless, but there is a lot of work behind it because there are a great many papers. There's a lot of data on global temperature because to measure this temperature is not easy. There's a lot of data sources. providing information, and all of them are taken into account when we draw up these consensus with an uncertainty framework that is applied in all of the evidence that we use. When we say it is indisputable that human activities are causing climate change, we don't say this just because we want to. We say it because there are studies simulating that black curve based on models. And when there is no chemical change, there's no change in the concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, and it is the same as in 1950, then there would be this green shadow that you can see here on the, but when it is impacted, when it is affected, and when there has been a change in greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, then you see that more orangey colored shadow there, which is what is shown in the observational evidence that we see. The only difference between these two simulations, the green and the orange, is the change that humans have made in the composition of the atmosphere. This is just one of many sources of scientific evidence that are grouped and included in the report that lead us to the conclusion that it is indisputable that human activity is causing climate change. From the scientific standpoint, this is not debatable. It's not an opinion, it's not a vision. It is a hard fact. Of course, there is a certain degree of uncertainty in evidence because when you put a cup of water in the microwave, the water heats up. We don't know how that happens, but it does. This is based on the exact same science. Science, which is that even if you wanted a microwave to work differently, it works the way it works because it is fueled by science. This is what spurs everything we say at the IPCC, and is always neatly summed up, and we attempt to word it so that it can be digested by the public at large. Basically, this is what is done in the report. And now just to finalize, because we're at this regional context, the novelty in the last report, this sixth report essentially says the same thing as the previous 5, okay? It says it more rotundly, it says it with more evidence, it is backed by more facts, all pointing in the same direction. It is perhaps more precise than the previous 5, but in reports, sometimes you can progress in certain topics that you haven't been able to progress in previous ones. Regionally, this is the first time the IPCC has conducted a regional analysis of climate change. And when I say regional, we're talking about these reference regions. They're subcontinental. We're not going to talk individually about what's happening in Madrid. We're going to be talking about the Mediterranean versus what might be happening in Australia or in Central America. And the assessment is done region by region because we have literature that allows us to do that. So far, the literature on regional climate change had been scarce. And when I say scarce, I don't mean that there hadn't been enough or that there hadn't been much. There just had not been enough to reach a consensus. If there are few articles or few papers, that doesn't provide sufficient evidence to make a firm statement based on consensus one way or another. And there are a whole series of figures now that say that it is indisputable that human activities are causing climate change. That's the same as before. And that these activities are leading to extreme climate events with heat waves, drought, torrential rainfall. This was backed by the Spanish Weather Agency's reports, and they're becoming more and more frequent and more severe. And this we can then break down region by region. So the report contains all of this information in order to issue key messages in different contexts. It is then also supported by supporting documents, and we've produced some regional fact sheets, an example of which you can see on the screen relating to Europe. This gathers the main conclusions, and I have to insist that this is all from a physical point of view. We're talking about the climate itself, not the impact of climate change. It shares what has happened and what is likely to happen in Europe based on parameters linked to temperature, humidity, and other parameters. Europe, as Valvanera was saying earlier, is a hot spot, so to speak, because the temperature here is rising at a faster pace than the average. And there is a clear signal that rainfall is descending. This is not true in other areas necessarily, and that there is going to be less available humidity, for instance, for agricultural purposes. So this is a particularly sensitive region. And now just to finish off, the CSIC, the Spanish Scientific Authority, had the opportunity to make a very visible contribution because I was coordinating the Atlas on Regional Climate Change, and we suggested using a new interactive tool to adapt to the times, but also strictly adhering to the principles of the IPCC, which means that it has to be reviewable, traceable, and so on and so forth. So we produced an atlas where you can see more detailed information. So all of the data that have been analyzed to draw up the report are shown here in a very visual and friendly way, though still backed on the robust science. This is also interactive so that you can click on a given region and you can see the global warming map on how the temperature is rising. And the IPCC seeks to take steps, they are slow steps, very slow but very steady, in order to adjust its reports and its products to place them at the service of decision makers, of policy makers, in the most humble way possible. What we're trying to do is to generate something that is actually useful and that can be used, for instance, by the Congress of Deputies in deciding what measures to take. And we have the best of intentions. And that's an important message I wanted to share, to make it truly clear that the IPCC is not a political player. All we want is to provide evidence so that it can be used or not used. We hope that it will. That is our aim. But there is no doubt as to what science says. This is what the science says. It is in the report, and those decisions can be made based on that. Thank you very much.
Muchísimas gracias, José Manuel. Como ha quedado
Thank you so much, José Manuel. As we can gather from your speech, the work methodology of the IPCC is very rigorous and very thorough. As you were saying, with the statement that it cannot, well, it is an absolute fact that humans are causing climate change. We have gone from the uncertainty of the first report to the absolute certainty of the sixth, really underpinned by the principle of precaution within the UN documents. And so I will give the floor to Jean-Françoise Soussana, which in this first speech, in this first contribution, he will be showcasing his experience as a member of the Scientific Council in climate change at the European level, and how he works in this council created by the European Act for Climate in 1991. Jean-François, you have the floor. Good morning. Thank you so much for your invitation. I do not speak Spanish. I do understand a little bit. I will be, therefore, speaking.
Morning, everybody. No, that's not the one, I think. I think we start with Europe. Not the right slides. It's, we need the European slides.
Por favor, es que la presentación ahora es la posterior. Necesitamos un cambio en la
We need to change the presentation, please. It is the later one. Could someone please in the room showcase Jean-Françoise' presentation, the technical team? Could you help us, please?
Was it not? Yes. I think it's not here. It's not here. It was sent. I think they are not on the laptop now. They were sent yesterday by the Yes. Sorry, we have a technical problem with the slides. We have to wait a few seconds.
Perdónennos, tenemos un problema técnico con las diapositivas.
Yeah, sure. Yes, no problems.
Bueno, tenemos que hacer, hablamos de cambio climático, pues tenemos también que meter a veces una dosis de adaptación también.
Since we're speaking about climate change, it is true that adaptation comes to the rescue, and we must adapt to a few quirks. And right now, we are putting up the presentation on screen.
So thank you so much. Now we are set. And I would like to address the role of the European Scientific Advisory Board. As we have heard this morning, it is important maybe to have this science base for the policies. And I will try to explain how we developed our recommendations on EU 2040 climate target. So this committee was established by the European Climate Law in 2021. We are 15 senior scientific experts. We are independent, obviously, and we cover a range of disciplines. So this body provides the European Union with scientific knowledge and advice relating to climate change, and it can evaluate the policies and the opportunities to achieve the EU climate targets. So here are the members. Our president is, elected president is Otmar Edenhofer, and we have two vice chairs, Jette from Denmark and Laura, who is actually from Spain, although she works in UK. Indeed, this committee was established in 2021, and so it was already inspired by some national committees, including those, for instance, in Denmark, in UK, in France. And we understand it has to focus on the latest scientific evidence and to provide oversight. it was interesting because before establishing these committees, there was a sort of assessment of what are the national climate change committees doing in Europe. And they are a bit diverse, one should say, but they have three roles. First one is to be a sort of independent watchdog. So monitoring if the climate action is sufficient. That's the role of the watchdog. The second one is a policy advisor, so creating recommendations for the policies. And the last one is like a convener, so convening the stakeholders and creating a debate. So the European climate law invites the member states to establish a national climate advisory body. And actually, our European Climate Committee works with the national committees. So what are our key tasks as defined by the European climate law? To consider, I said this already, the latest scientific findings. And indeed, these findings are already reviewed by the IPCC. So it's a lot about using the IPCC reports in the best way, but there is always new scientific literature coming. Providing the advice, contributing to exchange of knowledge, scientific knowledge, understanding what are the opportunities to achieve the European climate targets, raising awareness, and stimulating the dialogue and the cooperation between scientific bodies in the EU. So we already achieved quite a few reports, as you can see. So under the European climate law, and this was really answering the requests from the law, we had two reports on the European 2040 greenhouse gas target, and I will explain this. We started by a sort of methodological report, which was an initial advice. So we explained how we would work on this complex issue. And then in June 2023, we were able to provide a report with a quantitative advice on an EU 2040 target. And I will explain this. It's not only for 2040, it's also for the carbon budget over the total period of 2030 to 2050. Another role we have is to monitor the progress at the European scale. So we published this year a report on policy gaps and opportunities towards European climate neutrality. And this is a sort of classical, if I may say, policy gap assessment report, because we do this also in the national committees. Now we have, this is also in the law, a very specialized, in fact, activity, because it is about the trans-European energy infrastructure development. Obviously, we all realize that when we introduce a massive dose of renewable energies in those electricity transport systems, they need to be resynced. And it's nothing obvious. How are you going to do this? So we first produced a report on what would be the guidelines for planning the network development. And second, we had an input on the methodologies for EU energy system-wide cost-benefit analysis. Understand how you can deploy this with a relatively low cost, which is essential. I must say we had a report on our own initiative. It was about the energy crisis. This was published February 2023. Remember, just 1 year before, there was the start of the invasion by Russia of Ukraine. And you all know how high the energy costs were. And so we were really trying to think, what can we do? What can we recommend in this specific situation that nobody could really anticipate? So how can we face the crisis in terms of energy? And this was also at the time where we had the directive which was supporting the increased use of renewables in face of that energy crisis. So I think it was useful. So let me now focus on the EU target for 2040. I think that's also the theme for today. That's, in a nutshell, our recommendations. So a budget between 2030 and 2050, between 11 and 14 gigaton of CO2 equivalents, which means an emissions reduction in 2040 by 90 to 95%. I must say this is obviously very ambitious, but I will explain why we consider this. And if you remember that, however, we reach carbon neutrality, we should reach carbon neutrality in 2050, then it's at least 100% reduction. So 90% 2040 is very ambitious. But as we will see, according to the scientific evidence, it is feasible. And it is also a way to prove that Europe is having its role in the international community, because we will see there is a debate on fairness of what Europe is doing. So let me start with the objectives as they are defined in the climate law, to set a 2040 target and an indicative 2030-2050 emissions budget. And it is needed that the 2040 target proposal by the European Commission is within 6 months of the first Paris Agreement global stocktake. And as we heard from Anna, this stocktake already happened, and this was actually at COP28 in Dubai. So we should obviously provide the best and the most recent scientific evidence to support the Commission in understanding where to go with this target. So these are the principles that we have been using in this report. Obviously, we started with the legal context. These are the commitments under the European Climate Law, under the Paris Agreement, other relevant legal acts. And then we also wanted to understand what are the limits to the European emissions concerning, as I said, the EU's fair share of global emissions. So we should achieve something that is also fair for the other world regions. And concerning also the fact that here we consider the carbon budget, but they are non-CO2 greenhouse gases, and we should have this global carbon budget or European carbon budget in the context of the other greenhouse gas emissions. We were, and we stated this explicitly in the report, guided by value judgments, which are actually the European values. And those European values, they are in some legal text. We have a high-level legal expert in our group. And so we communicated transparently on the fact that we were using European values. So based on those principles, we could quantify the pathways to climate neutrality, selecting actually, I will explain this, the best scenarios, and combining different models and approaches. And then we try to understand what would be the implications of those pathways in terms of side effects, in terms of resilience, and here again, how feasible are those pathways. So you have the conclusions again, that's the range for 2030-2050, 11 to 14 gigatons CO2 equivalent, and staying in for 2040 within 90-95% reduction compared to 1990. So let's enter more into the details. The Paris Agreement requires that we would stay in a limit to global warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius. So how can you do this? You need to select scenarios that are feasible. So we started from more than 1,000 scenarios. We filtered and made feasibility checks based on a number of dimensions. I will explain this a bit more in the next slide. Then we got actually a very small number, only 7 scenarios were remaining, and they were indicating that it was feasible to go down by up to 95% by 2040. And we struggled a bit, I can say, with a fair share, because in the scientific literature, there are many ways to define what is fairness. In fact, there is nothing simple in what is fairness. It is, in fact, a reflection about ethical principles. So you could say it is historical responsibility. This is actually in the Paris Agreement, it is stated. You could say it is a polluter pays principle. You could say it's equality per capita. All this has been thoroughly discussed in our report. So that's the way we worked. We used a large database, which had most scenarios for Europe. And we asked the scientific community through a call for evidence to help us, including in that database, more scenarios whenever they were available. So we could obtain more than 1,000 scenarios. We excluded scenarios that did not contain enough data for Europe, obviously, that were not consistent with the objectives of Europe, and that were assuming highly implausible development on the short term. So I don't know if you think it is possible to have green hydrogen on a massive scale within 10 years, that's possible, not possible. So those sort of high-end hypotheses that are not realistic, we had to exclude the scenarios. Then we looked at filtering the scenarios with high feasibility, concerning some also the realism of having a primary biomass use for energy. So we know, in fact, we don't have so much biomass in Europe. Huh? So those scenarios that say we can produce more than 20 exajoules with that biomass, it was not realistic. Then we looked at some risks, because in fact, when you have on a large scale carbon capture, utilization and storage, it may mean, for instance, having some energy crops that you will burn the biomass, you will capture the CO2, you will liquefy that CO2, inject it in geological reservoirs, and in this way you get negative emissions. This is called the bioenergy with carbon capture and sequestration BECCS. So this has been assessed in the IPCC reports, and what we find is that if we develop BECCS on a large land area, you can well imagine the implications. Less land for food, less land for other uses. So we are really with a constraint here on the land available, and also the biodiversity, for instance. So we had to exclude scenarios that were too ambitious on that side, on the hydrogen in the short term. And we also had to think that it was maybe not realistic to expect that the final energy demand would decrease very quickly, because this would mean we change fully our lifestyles. Is this realistic? Well, we were doubtful. So having filtered out those scenarios, we went into the comparative feasibility analysis about the environmental risks and about the technological challenges, like how fast can we deploy the renewable energies. So these are the details. I may not need to read all those details, but you see, we went down to actually 7 scenarios that are feasible, where we had to say if we want to moderate the risk levels and have realistic technological deployment, it's only in the end 5 scenarios. And this is a range for 2040 compared to 1990. You see that, in fact, in the middle of the range, you have minus 90%, and the range is minus 88 to minus 92%. So coming back to fairness, we have to admit that, unfortunately, Europe has already, has already consumed a lot of its possible emissions, to be fair with other world regions. So I think you will not possibly be able to read the small letters here, but what it shows you is that this vertical bar is a range we can find with the various ethical principles that would constrain the emissions from Europe. And you see that even if we take the softer constraints, which is maybe here, we are still a bit below what we recommend in our report, which is minus 88, minus 92%. So we can say Europe has already almost exceeded its possibilities. To be fair with our world regions, we are trying to have the highest ambition to be the most fair as possible. That's the way we worked this out. So as you can see, we want to have the more ambitious end of the 2040 target range to improve the fairness of the EU contribution. And this is not enough. we need to work with the other countries to achieve a fair contribution to climate change mitigation. And that relates really to the negotiations under the UNFCCC. What can we do to help developing countries, low-income countries, achieving quickly their mitigation, but also certainly their adaptation. So if we represent this on a figure, you can see the minus 55% of Fit for 55 package. This is 2030. This is the recommended range we have in the report, minus 90 to minus 95%. And we expect that we would be actually with negative net emissions in 2050, because this would compensate, in fact, for any excess of the budget. Okay, thank you. Last, I think I will comment the different pathways to achieve climate neutrality. And quickly, I can say there are iconic pathways we can define. One is a pathway about the demand side. So it is really about our lifestyles, having lifestyles where we use less resources. The second is the high renewable energy pathway. So we would deploy at most all we can with the renewables. And we would have a high rate of electrification by 2040. And the mixed options pathways, which has the greatest deployment of carbon removals, but also some nuclear power. And I must say it is this one which was found to have the lowest cumulative emissions in the 2030-2050 period. So all scenarios have common features: decarbonization of the power sector, a large share of electricity in final energy, 70–90% of wind, solar, and hydropower, I mean. Coal almost phased out by 2030, natural gas by 2040, scale up of bioenergy and hydrogen, reduction of total energy demand, reduction of non-CO2 emissions. So this means we need to have efforts in agriculture, for instance, scale up of carbon removals, because we can use the land sink, although it is limited by the climate impacts, and some limited use of the bioenergy with carbon capture and sequestration. So the good news for this report and for our work is that the 2040 communication is closely aligned with the advisory board's recommendation, because EC has recommended a minus 90% net emission reduction target for 2040. So we were, in fact, quite happy that the Commission could use our report and the best scientific evidence to have a proposal. Obviously, this will be discussed in the coming weeks and coming months after the elections. And let me say that we can see here that from the stock takes of the member states, they do not really converge to minus 55% for 2030. In fact, more needs to be done by the member states to reach minus 55%. I will explain this for France also. And we set, as we have seen, this very ambitious target, minus 90% in 2040. And then the member states' projections are not aligned with this. So there will be a need to accelerate the reduction of the emissions post 2030. That's what we find. So messages: implement Fit for 55 fully and swiftly. That's essentially for the member states now. Have a series of revisions of the series of policy packages, like revising the energy taxation directive, phase out fossil fuel subsidies. This in itself is essential, but not achieved. A stable investment outlook for the renewables. So that's all we need to do already for 55. And already before 2030, we need to do more to reach net zero by 2050. So, for instance, we have issues with agriculture. We need to better address just transition, because maybe it's not yet there. We need to phase out the fossil fuels, target deployment on a limited scale, at least, of carbon capture, use of storage of hydrogen bioenergy, and support the investments. Then obviously later, after 2030, there's a lot to be done. It is certainly about governance, compliance, markets, and so on. I will not enter too much into the details now. Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias, Jean-François. Cuando veo la propuesta que se hace sobre acabar
Thank you so much, Francois. When I see this proposal about finishing with subsidies for fossil fuels, I always recall that in 2001, on a European Union Council in Sweden, when we were preparing the position of the European Union for the Johannesburg summit, we adopted a strategy for sustainability in the European Union in Rio +10, and it was agreed that the European Union would have to have ended subsidies for fossil fuels. And it's written, it's on paper, and I always recall that. I always recall it whenever we read about ending subsidies or aids for fossil fuels. So now we have with us from Denmark, Peter Møllgaard, who, as we were saying earlier, is president of the Danish Council for Climate Change.
Sorry, yes, I can hear you very well. Thank you.
We cannot hear you.
You cannot hear me?
Yes, now. Yeah, now.
Great.
Okay. So thank you for joining us from Denmark, and the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thanks so much. And I hope you can see my presentation now as well. Is that so?
Yes, it is. We can see it. Yes.
Fantastic. I have a total of 10 slides, including the first and the last. So that's your expectation. It's a great honor for me to be here.
Peter, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, please, if you can use the presentation mode, because otherwise it's very small and people in the audience cannot see it. If you can press the presentation mode, please.
But I did already press presentation mode, so I'll
okay. Okay, thank you. Anyway.
Just let me try one more time. Let me see. Is this better now?
Yes, now it's better. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. And sorry for not being in Spain with you. I was just in the Danish Parliament, and that's why I'm also a little bit late. The Danish Council on Climate Change has been working for almost 10 years now. We are supporting the European Scientific Advisory Board on climate change all we can. So we are very impressed with what is going on there with Professor Edenhofer and his crew. What I'd like to do is to talk about the role of the Danish Council on Climate Change in achieving climate neutrality, and give you both sort of the governance background, but also how far we are with this. And now I tried to change my slide. Can you see the next slide now?
Yes.
Great. So we have the most recent Danish Act on Climate Change is from 2020. And it establishes, among other things, a Danish Council on Climate Change that has to be, as it says here, composed of experts with broad expertise and high level of climate-relevant academic knowledge relating to energy, buildings, transport, agriculture, environment, nature, economics, climate research, and behavioral sciences of relevance to the climate field. And you can see the Council on Climate Change here. This is a group photo. It's a scary crowd, I'm sure you'll agree. And it is composed of 9 people with those different backgrounds, different disciplinary backgrounds. So it is a very interdisciplinary group which has recruited from 5 different Danish universities and 2 Norwegian institutions. And in that way, we cover all of these different disciplines that are needed according to the Act.
Peter, we cannot hear you well. It seems that there is a problem with the line. So would you mind to switch off your camera because maybe it will be better, please?
I'll try to do that. Yes. Let me just
Okay.
see if I can, where I can do that, given that
Thank you.
I'm in the presentation mode. It's not clear to me what I have to do to do that. Maybe I'll just see if I switch off the camera now. Can you hear me better?
Yeah, now it seems we can hear you better. We would work here also with the technical department to see whether it is our problem. Okay,
Great.
Thank you.
I'll
Thank
see
you.
if I can share again. Can you see my presentation now?
No, we cannot. Yeah.
Okay. Let me just see if I can do something about that. Sorry about this. I need to go to Zoom and share. Now I attempt to share my presentation again. Can you see it now?
Yes, now we can see it. Thank you.
So I'm supposed to be on the third slide now with the headline Denmark's Climate Act from 2020. So in that act, we have a domestic focus that puts in place two targets, actually three targets already. That's a target for 2025 of a 50 to 54% reduction compared with 1990. A target in 2030 of a 70% reduction compared with 1990, and climate neutrality at the latest in 2050. Now, in that domestic focus, the government has to come up with a climate action plan. And the role of the Danish Council on Climate Change is then to assess, to monitor if that action plan is sufficient to meet the targets. So every year in February, we have a big report. It's a rather thick report, almost 200 pages, with a lot of background material where we assess if the government is on track to meet its targets. And in the first 3 years we did this, we concluded that the government was not in line with the targets, not any of them. And in the most recent report from February 2024, we, for the first time, say that the 2025 target of 50 to 54% is likely to be met, but there's still something to do, especially in agriculture, in order that we can believe that the government will also reach the 2030 target of 70%. So that's the domestic focus, and that's how it works, and that's the role of the Danish Council on Climate Change. There is also a global focus in the Danish Climate Act, which is not as developed as the domestic focus. So you could say that the Danish footprint is about 50% larger if you look at the global focus than if you just look at the domestic focus. And that is something that we recommend that the government now I'm asked to start my video. I hope this works now. If not, then ask me to switch it off again. So the global focus is less developed, and we have recommended in a report from November 2023 that the government develops the global focus more and comes up with some targets also for the global focus. I already covered this more or less. So these are the current Danish climate targets of 2025, 2030, and 2050. And we are in the process of designing a report that sets targets for 2035. That will be a report that comes out in the autumn of this year to make sure that we have advise the government what the target should be. We have not concluded that analysis yet, so I cannot tell you a number, but we are working both on setting a number, but also on suggesting that, as I said, that the government should also care about what goes on outside the territory of Denmark, so have a more global focus. We have 3 roles in the Danish Council on Climate Change. We are this watchdog that I already talked about, that is almost like auditing the climate policy. So we follow and report on the Danish national targets, and that is to reduce the risk of spin, greenwashing, and lack of adequate action. And that is also quite evident in the political debate in Denmark, that this role means that the opposition in Danish Parliament, for example, reads our reports very carefully and actually would then address government and ask them, why are you not doing sufficiently? What would you want to do? What could we do? What do we suggest, opposition parties? What would we suggest to meet the Danish targets? So it's quite, we're quite often in the media, and especially, of course, around the annual status report that comes out in February. We also advise the government and parliament on climate policy, and you could say we are the independent, completely independent advisor to the government. There are lots of other advisors, and many of those other advisors are stakeholders in the sense that they also expect to get money from the from government to get their policy through, or their business suggestion through. So we cover the need for an outside and objective perspective. And then we are, as I am doing now, a public debater. We contribute and participate to the debate on climate policy in Denmark. And that's of course not only across Europe. We have talked previously this year also with the Czech Parliament in a similar situation, but especially inside Denmark, that raises the entire knowledge of what climate policy is and could be. This is the annual wheel. It's if you start in May, June, we have just yesterday commented on the government's climate status and outlook, and that's sort of the baseline. It's a government agency that publishes a climate status and outlook in April, and we then very carefully look through and see if we agree on the forecasts that they do. And very often we do not entirely agree, and this year we kind of agree, but we also note that there are large uncertainties in the predictions of government towards 2030, and that they need to take those risks into account. So that would be the report that came out yesterday. We will also later, in a few weeks, we'll come up with a comment on the government's account for Denmark's global carbon footprint, and that will likewise be critical of the government and assess if the government has a fair way of dealing with statistics in this area and predictions. In September, by law, by the Danish Climate Act, the government has to come up with a climate program. And we then will, in October and November, comment on that climate program and other climate policy that the Danish Parliament, that the Danish government suggests to Parliament. And that is also something that is very regularly in the media. And in late December, there's a duty to act debate in Parliament that builds a lot on our views on the Danish Council on Climate Change, analysis of the status for the for Danish climate policy. And in principle, Parliament can then order government to act. So there's a duty to act debate in Parliament in December, just around Christmas, where the Danish Parliament essentially can order the Danish government to do more than they do, and they have on at least one occasion in 2021 asked the Danish government to act and do more than they had originally planned. And then we come with our report in February on the status outlook that assesses on a very broad basis the government's policy, not only what would be officially designated climate policy, but the broad range of policies that affect greenhouse gas emissions. It starts all over again, and that's the annual wheel that we have done now 4 times since the establishment of the Climate Act of 2020. We have, as a council, some crucial values that we adhere to and that we actually monitor. We have, of course, our scientific expertise that needs to be current. We are just advertising 2 positions of the Danish Council on Climate Change, because you can only sit in the Danish Council on Climate Change for a maximum of 8 years, and we have 2 members that have served for that long. They have to step out, and we are recruiting 2 new ones, so we need to refill the scientific expertise of the Danish Council on Climate Change. We very carefully monitor independence, which is why, for example, all the talks that I have with stakeholders are published on the internet, on the homepage of the Danish Council on Climate Change. And that goes for all members. We also, if we have other roles to play, if you are a member of a supervisory board of a company or something like that, then it's also listed on the homepage of the Danish Council on Climate Change. So we are very transparent in what we do, who we meet, and all of that means that we have a lot of credibility. And we monitor the credibility. We have a stakeholder forum, the Climate Dialogue Forum, that has 43 different stakeholders that represent each a group. For example, the Confederation of Danish Industries is represented, and they represent pretty much manufacturing sector in Denmark, and others like that. Those are the stakeholders, and we monitor if they think we are credible, and we have a very high level, I'm happy to say, of credibility. And we also, for that reason, always base our advice on solid scientific grounds. And meeting with the stakeholders also means that we try to stay relevant. So we try to understand what the stakeholders, including, of course, very importantly, government, think are important issues, and then we try to make our reports in that way. So based on that advice. So credibility and relevance are 2 key components that we juggle, and we would rather be a little bit irrelevant than being incredible. So if we need to take another week or 2 or 3 to finish a report because we think it needs that for scientific sanity, then we take our time to do that. And that sometimes means that we come out a bit late, but typically we try to place our reports so that they are relevant. Here are the current important focus areas established in our report from February this year. And you would say that the concrete climate policy must fulfill many different objectives. The National Climate Act focuses on both the short and the long term, and the national and the global dimension. And for that reason, we need a wide range of measures. So in assessing the government's climate policy, as I mentioned in the previous slides, there's a focus on national goals and also our EU obligations towards 2030. And you could say, just as a side remark, the fact that we got Fit for 55 and the European Climate Act also means that the Danish targets from EU, our EU obligations, are actually driving Danish climate policy as much as the National Climate Act at this point. But it's also clear that the climate policy must make sense in the longer perspective and aim for climate neutrality. So we are very aware of suggestions from government, and they do come, that try to fix, for example, the 2025 target, but has not has less favorable effects on the long run climate targets. So, for example, climate neutrality. And I could come up with an example of that if you allow in the debate. And at the same time, we have in Denmark an ambition to be a leading country in the climate area, and we have very many opportunities to reduce emissions of greenhouse gases outside of Denmark's border. So climate policy must also focus on a broader and more global perspective. With these recommendations, the the Climate Council points to the most important elements that climate policy should take care of in the near future. Here we point to 7, those green boxes. And these are 7 important focus areas. Some areas are particularly aimed at the short-term goals, while others have a more long-term and international perspective. In order to reach the target by 2030, the Climate Council points to the need to support climate policy with monitoring and implementation. Implementation is increasingly important as we approach 2030. And it's implementation of already adopted measures. So we already have agreements in Parliament, we already have the policy in place, and that now needs to be implemented. And that's an increasing focus. One of the areas that we focus a lot about on these days would be agricultural emissions, but also the regulation of transport emissions. When we get to 2030, more than 80% of Danish emissions on the territory will be from agriculture and transportation. So we need to cover these and find solutions for these quite soon. In a longer and broader perspective, the Climate Council points to the need to strengthen the global framework, as I mentioned before, and to reduce the climate footprints from the Danish consumption. We need to limit the use of biomass. We are very heavy users of biomass in Denmark. And we need to expand with wind and solar energy, so renewables need to be cranked up quite significantly and in the immediately coming years.
Peter, you have just more 5 minutes and...
Yes, I have one more significant slide and then I'll wrap up. Thank you. So just to wrap up the reactions to our methodology and the way we work, as I said, Parliament has once enacted the duty to act, so ask government to do more than it does. The government has, to a very large extent, accepted the recommendations of the Danish Council on Climate Change and actually adopted our terminology, so we can see that we have impact in that way, and they accept the different ways we look at things. And we have a very broad stakeholder acceptance, so you could say our stakeholders are equally happy or, as it were, unhappy with us, which I think is a sign of strength. So this was my last slide, and this slide is, and now I can hear myself.
Okay, so thank you.
This is a slide just to say that we have done a number of reports. Many of the reports have English summaries, executive summaries that you can find on our homepage.
Thank you, Peter. I understand that you must leave in 5 minutes because we are going to have questions and answers for everyone. No sé si hay alguien en la audiencia que...
El mío también.
I can't hear anything right now.
We apologize, but there is no sound. There's some technical problems and there is no sound. We cannot interpret at this moment.
Question, 3 brief points. I'll, for the sake of all members of the panel, I'll speak in English. And I would also appreciate the opinion of Cristina Narbona afterwards. But my points are the following. What's our perception of the recent recoil, backwards movement of the European Commission as regards agro-environmental policies under the pressure of the right and ultra-right in Europe and the powerful agricultural lobbies?
Disculpa, es que ahora solo son preguntas para Peter, porque después va a venir una
I'm
presentación.
sorry, these are questions only for Peter because later on we will have another presentation from Jean-Françoise Soussana, but Peter must leave. If perhaps the question is also relevant to him because there is a problem with agriculture in Denmark, as he has explained. I would just like you to keep this into account.
Because I would like to know your perception about this thing. I've got other more general questions for later. Thank you.
Gracias. Should I just answer now?
Yes, please.
So I'm not going to comment on the European agricultural reactions and of the European so the political aspects. What we are very careful about in Denmark is to negotiate with agriculture, and right now the government is negotiating in a tripartite setting with agriculture and to find a solution whereby we put a greenhouse gas taxation on emissions from the Danish agriculture. And I cannot tell you the outcome of that. I can tell you what the Danish Council on Climate Change has recommended, and that is a greenhouse gas taxation of 750 Danish kroner. That is about 100 euros per ton CO2 equivalents from emissions from the Danish agriculture. That's not the only thing. We also suggest that in order to facilitate the green transition of agriculture, that we need to support various initiatives, new technologies with money as well. And I think that the report that we have made 2 reports on agriculture. I think they both enter into these negotiations that are ongoing. So I cannot tell you what is going to happen, but government tells us that they will find a solution in June. And I hope that we'll see a different reaction of Danish agriculture because of this negotiation than the ones that we have seen across Europe. But this is as far as I can get now, but except for one more thing, and that is of course extremely helpful for a green transition in Denmark of the agricultural sector if all countries contribute, including the common agricultural policy. So we are in this boat together, and the more that we can say that we pull in the same direction, the better it is. But we are taking a quite strong step, I believe, in Denmark, and I'm hoping that we can come up with a solution that will not lead to riots in Denmark in agriculture, but we'll have a calmer outcome, and maybe that way we can show the way for the rest of Europe.
Okay, Peter. So thank you very much for connecting today with us,
Thanks for having me.
and we will be in touch. Thank you very much. Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Adiós. Bueno, y ahora, como había comentado cuando presentaba esta mesa, voy a dar paso.
As we were saying, I will once again give the floor to Jean-Françoise Soussana because we are incredibly lucky to have him here. Apart from his experience as a member in the European Scientific Council, he also belongs to the High Council for Climate of France, of the French government. It would be incredibly useful and positive to get to observe both outlooks at the EU level and at the national level. And so we can compare both experiences. Jean-François, go ahead. We apologize. Oh.
Because the French committee is also producing annual reports. So we are a group of 12 experts plus a chair, We are nominated by the Prime Minister, and we report to the Prime Minister. Then there is, after our annual reports, there is a feedback from the government, so the government answers our recommendations. And there is also a possible feedback from the Parliament. So in theory, the Parliament should also comment the answer by the government, if you see how it goes. I must say we didn't have really formal reports of the Parliament on the answer of the government, but we did have answer from the government. However, they take about 6 months. Yes, I see the slide is a bit complex, but this is what I've been explaining. We are the Haut Conseil pour le Climat, and this is the government, and this is the Parliament, and this is the way it feeds back after our reports. So we've been active over 6 years, and besides having annual reports, they are in blue here. Each year you find something in blue, which is our annual report. We have something which is for the general public, mentioned here GP. So that's a much shorter brief, which is illustrated. We have very good illustrators, and actually we find it is this short version that is mostly read by people. We have also some requests from the government. These come in orange or purple to write some specific reports on some specific themes. So I will not give you the full list of those reports because in fact there are quite a few. But for instance, we had one on the economic policy, which was at the time of the COVID. We had a specific report on the carbon footprint. We had some reports for the buildings, how to renovate buildings. We had reports on the energy system in France. And also we have reports concerning the international dimension. So what happened, for instance, at COP28. And we are now completing our 2024 report, which will be published by the end of June. So let me say a few words of what's happening in France. This is from our last year report. In fact, at that time, we had to say that we were not really having the reductions in emissions that was expected, because this is a trajectory for France, historical trajectory, and this is the budgets, the 4-year budgets we have for our national strategy for low carbon. So these are the budgets that France should respect. And we were saying that we should accelerate quite a bit if we want to fit those budgets and reach actually Fit for 55. We were also saying that there was a deficit of around 30 billion euros in terms of investments. So investments were not at the levels that is required. And we are pointing to those fossil fuel subsidies, which I must say have been extremely high during the energy crisis. And obviously, it's a bit crazy when you think about it. You have a climate policy, so you need to reduce fossil fuel use, but then you subsidize fossil fuel use on a high level. Sounds really bizarre. But however, this was the case, and we explained it had to be phased out. I must say this year is much better. It has been in part phased out. And we were explaining that indeed we need a just transition. Maybe you remember, it is already some years ago, that we had this yellow jacket social movement in France. You might remember this. And it was triggered actually by the carbon taxation. So it was frightening, in fact, the government, because then they said, okay, we cannot increase the carbon price. But it was mostly a just transition problem because the yellow jackets, most of them were people like they had some, high bills in terms of energy for their homes because the homes were not insulated. They were commuting to work on long distances by car, and these were really sort of low-income people. And this was the reason why they were protesting, because they could not bear the rise in the carbon tax. But so I think it was not well assessed by the economists, and I hope there is a learning process with this. So we are emphasizing the risks to fail in the transition, because the transition will not be just, and there will be high costs for low-income people and households. So let me say that we have another way of working, which is to look at the impacts of climate change and at the adaptation pathways. And we think it's very important. This is the example of last year, year 2022, in fact. And I think it is very, very similar from what we heard from your ministry. 2022, we had 3 heat waves. We had minus 25% of precipitation, rainfall, if you like, in France. So it was an extremely dry year, very hot. And in fact, over the last decade, the warming in France reached plus 1.9 degrees Celsius compared to pre-industrial. And France is really exposed, as I guess Spain, to the impacts of climate change. So you can here see on the map the heat waves, their locations, the fires. Forest fires were very strong in the Atlantic forest, in the Mediterranean forests. We had crop losses by minus 30%. The hydroelectric production went down by 20%. And the soil drought was around 3/4 of the land in France. So really high impacts. And in addition, close to 3,000 additional deaths occurred because of the heat, mainly. And 2,000 municipalities didn't have enough water. And 7 municipalities had no water at all, potable water, water for drinking water, I mean. So these are really strong concerns. So we are monitoring what's happening with the impacts. And we are trying to look at the pathways for adaptation and resilience. And some progress has been made, because now the government has accepted the ideas that, in fact, we are likely to face plus 4 degrees Celsius. So we are likely to need adaptation versus plus 4 degrees Celsius. And there are many things to adapt for this. So we started having questions about agriculture and food. And we heard already from also Peter that, the residual emissions after 2030, 2040, and so on, they will be largely with agriculture. Agriculture is going to become possibly the first sector in a number of countries. So that's why we had a special report on food systems. Why use food systems as a framing? Because we believe it's not only the production, it is also what we eat. And we have to consider the benefits of healthy diets. Actually, healthy diets can bring co-benefits for health, obviously, but also for the environment, for climate. And so if we are to reduce the public health costs, which are huge, in fact, from diseases, chronic diseases linked to nutrition, malnutrition, we can have huge co-benefits. So that's why we had this framing. And obviously, agriculture in France is already the second emitting sector, with around 18% of the emissions. And there are relatively modest targets for this sector in our national strategy. Further, we are importing food, and therefore the food system footprint of France reaches 22% of our emissions. So it's quite big, really. So in this report, we said we need to take that food system perspective. We need to have actually policies that are articulated between the climate policies, the health policies, and the environment policies. And therefore, we need to integrate the climate also in the common agricultural policy much better than before. And we need to have possible third carbon market. And this was, I think, well assessed by Peter and by the Danish committee. It is a perspective that DG Klima is trying to put forward, have a carbon market also for agriculture and food. It's not very clear how this would be happening. And I must say, we are just starting with the European Committee a new report to study this. Well, to study this food system question, but also this possibility of a third carbon market. So maybe I will skip this slide, but it's just explaining that we need to have actually a consistent policy framework in France. It was, well, you know, there are always some circumstances, let's say, in policy making. At a stage, we were very hopeful because the government was speaking of bringing together mitigation, adaptation, and energy in a single law. So we were thinking that's very good, and we were supporting this. Now, apparently, they cannot make it in the parliament with such a law. So we are quite concerned that there is no strong legal framework, and we are pushing the government to try to create a framework. And that's just the last slide. I think it's about really the advance with the Fit for 55 and having France being aligned with Fit for 55 and with the post-2030 targets, so the 2040 targets. That also is what we are pushing for. Thank you.
Ok, ahora sí es el momento de hacer preguntas. Tenemos como...
Now we have time for Q&A. We have 15 minutes at most before the coffee break.
I'll keep talking English for the benefit of the panel. First of all, what do you think about the need for a conceptual framework on joining the three negationisms, the three denials that are so dangerous for our future, particularly ahead of the European Parliament elections, including, of course, the climate denial, the demographic denial, including xenophobia, anti-immigrationism, and the democratic denial, including misinformation, including denial, populist denial of actual democratic principles. It's not only a conceptual academic debate. We should have, as a society, instruments, tools to fight these very dangerous situations. And we are going to the European Parliament elections. We are at the end of the year, we'll have the USA elections. We are risking a lot for the future of humankind in these negationisms. Okay, and finally, another point. This is an abrupt and provocative proposal with my utmost respect. I lecture on human ecology in the Universidad Autónoma de Madrid. And what's my responsibility to my students? I mean, there is a growing consensus among the scientific community, and of course, inside the environmentalist world, about the impossibility that the objectives of the Paris Agreement are not attainable under the current geopolitical, socio-economical, technical circumstances. So shouldn't we, it's not our responsibility to say as scientists and teachers to society that we are not simply going to attain that in the current framework. Finally, if you go to the doctor with a colon cancer, it wouldn't be practical for you to be told that you've got appendicitis. It would be more practical for you to get a proper diagnosis. It's not our responsibility to provide that diagnosis to the society.
Había otra pregunta más para que el panel pueda responder a estas previas.
Could we hear another question so that we could answer as a group?
Como quieras, ellos también tienen traducción, o sea que como quieras.
As you wish, there is interpretation, so you can speak in Spanish or in English.
Event, we think it's very crucial. I'm Pedro Zorrilla Miras. I'm working in Greenpeace. And I have a question to Jean-Françoise, Soussana. your analysis of for the 2040 targets for the EU is excellent, of course. But we use a different approach for proposing a target for 2040. You have analyzed the different scenarios available in the literature, and then compare it with the fair share that should be used for the European Union. And we use the other approach. We start with the fair share that should be allocated to the European Union, and then we propose actions to achieve it. Still, as you have in your analysis, there are in the different approaches of the fair share, a lot of them provide a negative budget for the European Union. Only the one using the per population, per habitant provide a positive budget, like still some positive still remaining budget for the European Union. We use also this approach, and we acknowledge that as you propose, that the European Union should provide finance to compensate for the fair share. And then my question is, how do you think about this other approach, using first the fair share and then afterwards looking at what policies should be applied to achieve this one? Because that would mean that the target for 2040 would be the net zero target. Well, that's your opinion. And also, summing to this and from your...
Por favor, más breve porque es que tenemos que...
Okay.
Tenemos otras
Please, could you
preguntas.
be brief because we have other questions?
France, what do you think as a possible climate policy to provide we call it in Spanish, renta climática, like a climate budget for every citizen that would compensate for example, the decreasing of the subsidies for fossil fuels? Thank you.
Bueno, hay otra persona más que quiere hacer una pregunta. Yo creo que se pueden hacer perfectamente.
There's someone else that wants to ask a question. We are in the House of Commons in Spain, and we have live translation. I believe that we can convey our message better in our mother tongue, especially to be brief. Thank you.
It's my field, and you were focusing your presentation on agriculture at the end of the presentation. And I am specialized in agroecology. I know that France is one of the countries in Europe that are in the head of the application of agroecological measures. One of the problems that we are having to implement agroecological measures in the field, in the agricultural fields, is the lack of services of rural areas. I don't know if this is the problem also in France, and how did you approach to find a solution to this problem? And the second question that I have is that I am a teacher of plant physiology at the University of Vigo, and I am impressed how few things students at the university know about climate change. So we have a huge problem of education from the basis of the school, because they arrive at the university at the Faculty of Biology that you expect that, I mean, at least they are interested in this field, and they have a huge lack of information of education. So I don't know if France has some, I know that some countries like Denmark and other countries have
a matter in the school, in the basic school, about environmental sciences, about climate change. Other countries have transversal matters. I don't know how is going that in France. I am also curious about. Thank you very much. Yes, please.
Okay, thank you. So important questions indeed. May I say that we are acting a bit too late, isn't it? I think it was telling what you said about Johannesburg, that they already asked to ban the fossil fuel subsidies. But how long was this? It was 15 years ago, or? No,
it was said in 2020. Sorry, in 2002.
Okay, so more than 20
in 2010.
Yeah, more than 20 years ago. So you see, that's really our problem. I mean, humanity, if you like. We know the problem. We know more and more. Thank you, José Manuel, for this, your presentation. IPCC is just getting the knowledge more and more accurately with more and more details. We know almost everything about what's going to happen. We can see it. I think it's rare to see people that don't believe something's happening with climate. It's really, it would be very strange. So, however, it seems we take really long delays for collective action. And there are obviously many reasons. I don't have time to expand for this, but there is indeed the weight of bias in information. I guess you've been, some of you, aware of books published by some sociologists and respected scientists, social scientists, studying the role of lobbies in the disinformation about climate change. This has been very well documented. So it's not like people don't understand it, governments don't understand it. No, it's not like that. There are very active lobbies that are very well equipped with communication tools, lobbying tools, that just don't want people to go in that direction. And it's very efficient. They are very professional. So that's my personal belief, at least, that we should not be too naive about it. And then your question is really fundamental. It's like, are we going to succeed or not? And if we feel it's not very likely we're going to succeed, should we say, well, in fact, we're not going to succeed, so why not stop everything? Huh? But as you can realize, this would be a catastrophe, because the number of deaths, whatever we can do with climate change, maybe we will never stay within 1.5 degrees Celsius. Maybe even if we experience an overshoot, carbon capture or negative emissions will not be enough to bring us back to 1.5 degrees Celsius. But whatever we can do about climate change will save people from death, will reduce the burden on ecosystem and nature. So I think we have to stay extremely motivated and active about this. And try to convince again and again the governments and the stakeholders that it is extremely urgent. So I don't think it is a matter of saying, will we succeed in 2050, that the world is carbon neutral or not? I hope we will be close to this. And I think it is feasible. The reasons that could stop or prevent us from doing so is more about, here again, some bias in collective actions, but the deployment of technologies and so on, there are credible pathways, I think. So that was my first point. So it connects very well with your question. Sorry, I didn't recall your name, but you are from Greenpeace. And your question is interesting. And you say, why not start with a fair share and define the role of Europe starting from this? You know, that's a bit a theoretical view, because as I've tried to show on the graph, if you take maybe the middle of the bar of the fair share, you are in a region where actually we cannot make it. So are we going to say, look, we should be there, but we cannot? So what's the conclusion, you know? Stop everything? It's not going to work. So start with feasibility and then look what you can do and try to work with the other countries. I have to say that the international negotiations on climate change are quite disappointing, aren't they? Look at the amounts, budget amounts for the newly created fund on losses and damages. It's quite ridiculous, frankly speaking. 76 million. Well, maybe more from UAE and so on, but that's so small compared to the residual impacts after adaptation. And even the investments in the climate fund have been very small. 100 billion may seem big, but in fact it's not compared to the real magnitude of the problem. So I think that's really a crucial question. When I'm with my colleagues in Africa and elsewhere, or in some of the UN agencies, I really hear criticisms from, let's say, high-income countries. We are not taking our responsibility seriously. And if we don't take it seriously, the negotiations will not work. So it's really critical, this. Then let me address your question. And so it's funny, I need to talk with you because I started with plant physiology also. But yes, well, we are trying with agroecology in France. As you well know, it's a sort of a middle pathway between organic farming, which is in fact, with reductions in yields which are quite severe, and let's say conventional agriculture, which is creating a lot of environmental problems. So we try to go in that line. And your question is very good about extension services, because in fact, we do have chambers of agriculture, as we call them, that are the, let's say, extension services, but they are very influenced, in fact, by the companies. And then we have large companies that are also advising directly the farmers. But there was a law in the parliament trying to separate advice and sales, because if I'm selling a product, a pesticide, maybe I should not advise also on that is not logical. So there is a law. I'm not sure it's very well respected, and in fact, it's still many efforts to do to improve the situation. And your last point is extremely important on education. It is evident that the future depends on the degree of education that our kids have. It is also educating, I must say, the ministers, educating the high-level civil servants. So this has started in France, I can tell you, and all high-level civil servants are supposed to have, some sort of updates, and it is organized on climate change, biodiversity, and so on. So let's be hopeful, huh?
Muy bien, pues muchísimas gracias. Creo que ha quedado claro
Thank you very much. I believe that the significant role of science for decision making in the political arena has been made quite clear. Without further ado, let's go to the coffee break to have time. We also have translators, and we have very strict schedules. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias por acompañarnos en esta última sesión.
Thank you very much for joining us in this final session of the event organized by the IIDMA on the climate targets for 2040. It is my huge pleasure to lead this session, to moderate this session entitled Climate Action in the Political Sphere Beyond 2030. We will have with us Vicky Pollard, who's the head of unit, the European Commission for the Climate Directorate General, and representative of the European Commission, who's going to be talking to us about the climate target for Europe for 2040 and the road towards climate neutrality in 2050, building a sustainable, fair, and prosperous society. Then we will be hearing from Mr. Naidu, who is responsible for the South African Presidential Commission on Climate, talking about the measures to achieve a determined contribution at the national level in South Africa.
Joining us in this last session. We are joined by an excellent panel of speakers. Vicky Pollard, she's the head of Unit Foresight, Economic Analysis and Modelling of the European Commission at DG Klima. They also undertake the greenhouse gas inventory and reporting of climate action. The team is also responsible, amongst other things, for the 2040 climate target impact assessment and communication. She has worked for 2 decades now at the European Commission. Since 2016, she's covered a number of issues over time, including international climate negotiations, cooperation with OECD countries, just transition, the design and cooperation of market-based instruments, including the ETS and international carbon markets. And she was Councillor for Environment and Climate at the EU's delegation to China in Beijing. Vicky, thank you ever so much for joining us. I'm not sure whether you can hear me. Can you?
I can hear you very well, thank you.
Brilliant. So Vicky is going to talk to us about the 2040 goal, and we know that the European Green Deal states that we will be the first quote-unquote climate neutral continent by 2050, and we know that we have to, and it has been said before, in the event that we have to set our 2040 goal. In February this year, the European Commission released its communication about with their recommendation on reducing 90% greenhouse gas emissions compared to 1990 levels by 2040. We also know that the European Green Deal sets the objective in its final part of maintaining Europe's leadership, climate leadership. We have been leaders by example for many years, and I believe that the external and internal dimensions of the European Green Deal will also need a more holistic climate diplomacy. So that engagement that Vicky has worked on with international partners is going to be absolutely crucial, including the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism and the European Deforestation Regulation. Just transition is obviously going to be a key lever in order to assure that we have internal acceptance of climate policies, which is the next frontier. We've talked about climate policies. We've talked a little bit about the demand for climate action. I think it's something that Vicky will talk to us about. So Vicky, please, whenever you're ready. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me okay. Please shout. Yes. Okay, thank you very much. So thank you for this opportunity to present to you today. Our team was responsible for the impact assessment and the communication for the 2040 climate target assessment, working in parallel with our colleagues in DG ENA. So it's a joint exercise between DG Climate and Climate Action and DG Energy, but we've worked very closely also, a lot of inputs from Directorate Generals across the Commission, because this is now very such a cross-cutting issue, such requires policies way beyond the climate and energy field. I'm hoping my slides will forward properly. There you go. So the context for the communication which came out in February and the recommendation for the 2040 target is one where climate change is intensifying rapidly. You see on the left the graph in terms of annual average temperatures, but that's feeding through into climate impacts, which in turn feed through into costs to people, to the economy, and those costs are increasing very rapidly. The IPCC in the 6th assessment report, and I know you've had a number of scientists speaking this morning, but there's been very clear on the need to cut greenhouse gas emissions sharply and rapidly at global level to prepare for the impacts of climate change. And of course, it also comes against the context of the COP28 and the global stocktake, the first global stocktake that took place in December last year. And very importantly, parties in the COP and in the global stocktake set minimum expectations for action. There were important decisions or important initiatives around improving energy efficiency in terms of speeding up the uptake of renewable energy capacity, generation capacity. This is really important to show that this is not the EU moving ahead alone. This is very much about the world moving towards the path taken by the EU. Also to mention a very important piece of work which came out in March of this year, which is the European Climate Risk Assessment and the communication that accompanied that climate risk assessment. So the risk assessment was published by the European Environment Agency, and there was a Commission communication at the same time, very much focusing on the need for action so that we are resilient to the changes coming, that we take the appropriate ownership and policy action and action across society to prepare for those impacts of climate change that we can no longer avoid. But of course, these very much go hand in hand, and it's clear that we will not be able to adapt our way out of the climate change that is coming, and that we do need to take ambitious action to cut our emissions. So the 2040 target communication does a number of things. There's some things it doesn't do at this stage, which will come later. So what it does do is recommend a climate target for the EU for 2040, which is a net greenhouse gas target. It does not, however, propose put forward a legal proposal to amend the European climate law. That comes under the next Commission. It's simply a question of timing, with the European elections very close, with a new Commission coming in. It's just the right of the next Commission to come forward with such a legal proposal. But we set the scene and we're preparing the ground with in-depth conversation. The communication responds to the climate law. The European climate law requires us to come forward with the next intermediate target between 2030 and 2050. But what it doesn't do is change the 2030 framework, which has just been agreed. So we have the Fit for 55 package, which is now essentially almost entirely in legislation, that member states are working very hard to transpose legislation, to implement the measures necessary to meet the 55% net greenhouse gas reduction in 2030, and that framework remains unchanged. However, what will happen with the 2040 target is that we provide more certainty about the direction of travel, and that's very important in terms of predictability for investors, to know that when they're making investments to meet 2030 targets, where they need to be beyond 2030. The policy framework that will allow us to meet the 2040 target, that will also be designed in the coming years. There are a number of review clauses in legislation adopted under the Fit for 55. Of course, those are only recently adopted, but the work will happen in the next couple of years to prepare the policy framework so that it's fit for purpose, so it's fit to meet the 2040 target. And the 2040 target will also be the basis for the new nationally determined contribution, NDC, to be submitted in 2025 in good time for COP30. And most importantly, and that's why I was keen to be here today, and I'm sorry that I can't be here in person, but it's very important that we engage with all our stakeholders, because this communication launches a broad political and wider stakeholder debate on the action needed to get to climate neutrality. The communication sets a comprehensive vision for the EU beyond 2030. So it's not just about the target, it's also about what that target means. And it's very clear about the opportunities that come with ambitious action for investment, for quality jobs, and for a strong industrial ecosystem. It's about the EU being in a position to lead in developing clean technologies and to lead in the clean technology markets of the future. It's also for the EU itself necessary that we have access to clean, low carbon, affordable energy, but also sustainable food and materials. And obviously, this is very much about our resilience against the future climate crises and reducing our exposure to climate impacts. But it's also about resilience against other future crises. And I will go into a little bit what this means also in terms of strengthening the EU's strategic autonomy. And as mentioned in the introduction, this is about the EU remaining a global leader and a trusted partner in international climate action, because we are now 7% of global emissions, but we have a very important impact through our action and the message that sends. The global climate agenda has been also evolving rapidly. Our own cooperation with third countries has been expanding over more than a decade, and we keep strengthening the cooperation, we keep strengthening our climate diplomacy, the Commission working closely with member states, and the EU and its member states are the largest donor in terms of climate finance, and this is very important, but also very important the partnerships that we're creating to work with emerging economies, also with other developed countries, but also and LDC, so that we can help create the momentum needed in all the policy areas to achieve climate neutrality and to our own example to lead by example. So what we do in the EU to lead by example. And we are intensifying our carbon market diplomacy, and in the communication, there was an announcement on the creation of a carbon markets task force within DG Klima, and that task force is now in operation. They're recruiting the staff who will be available to work with partners around the world to set up and to improve their domestic emissions trading systems, and also work more generally for strong international carbon markets. And that happens, of course, alongside the implementation of the CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, which ensures that there's no leakage for the products covered, so that as we increase ambition, the products that enter the EU market from other countries face the same carbon price as products produced within the EU market. Moving on to what did we actually recommend in terms of a target? And so you will see in the communication that we recommend a 90% net greenhouse gas reduction compared to 1990 levels. And what this means in practice in terms of the breakdown, the analysis and the impact assessment shows that in 2040, the remaining gross greenhouse gas emissions, so what we actually emit in the EU, should be less than 850 million tons of CO2 equivalent. And alongside that, we will need carbon removals. We need to ramp up the carbon removals, both land-based and industrial carbon removals, and these should reach up to 400 million tons of CO2 by 2040. With the 2040 target, we also calculate what this means for the greenhouse gas budget for 2030 to 2050. That is the total volume of greenhouse gas emissions in terms of CO2 equivalent that the EU would emit. So the amount of space available left to stay within 1.5 degrees, and it applies also to other temperature targets. But if you, what's very important is that we minimize our contribution to using up the budget that's remaining. And so this is an indicative budget of 16 gigatons for the period 2030 to 2050 as required in the European Climate Law. And the assessment is based on a detailed impact assessment produced by the Commission. So on the left, you have the title page for the main report, but it's a main report of just over 100 pages. But in total, with annexes, we have 605 pages of information which it's important to look at in terms of the modelling we undertook, the assumptions we took in that modelling, the scenarios we used, but also what we assumed in terms of current policies, what existing policies we have. Also, a very important chapter on costs of inaction, and I'll come on to that. But we looked at what it would mean if we didn't take the action linked to the recommended target. The communication, the impact assessment is also draws on and corresponds with the advice of the European Scientific Advisory Board on Climate Change. And I know you've had a number of members of the board speaking this morning. It's very important advice. That came out in June 2023 and was really very important for the impact assessment process and the communication. So for the impact assessment, we did a detailed assessment of 3 pathways between 2030 and 2050. All 3 start at the point we will be at in 2030 under our legislation and reach climate neutrality in 2050. And what you can see here is that the recommended target is at the lower end of the preferred option, target option 3, which was a 90 to 95% scenario. But what it means is that we will take more action in the EU in the lead up to 2040 and a bit less in the second decade. And that was the recommended target for because it led to the highest benefits for the EU. I'll come on to that. There are important benefits of ambitious climate action. As I said, there is an annex in the impact assessment which looks at the climate impacts and the costs of inaction. So we have a report that was issued just before the communication from the European Environment Agency that looks back at what climate change has meant historically, and we know from that it's meant 650 billion euros of losses for the EU economy between 1980 and 2020, and 220,000 deaths. But what's important also is that those impacts are far greater towards the last 5 years of that period because the impacts are accelerating. And so we looked at the difference. We did some macroeconomic analysis looking at the difference between a scenario where the current NDCs are implemented and a 1.5 consistent scenario. And what that shows is that for the EU, in a very conservative estimate, there would be a loss in GDP of 7% by the end of this century. I say that's very conservative because it doesn't take into account, for example, any tipping points. It doesn't take into account any valuation of loss of life. And we know there's a number of studies that have been papers published since or in preparation, which show far greater costs using different methodologies. And so this is really just to show that it's important, but actually this is a very conservative estimate. The co-benefits of greenhouse gas mitigation are large. Of course, we will have air quality improvements as we decarbonize the energy sector and transport. So lower morbidity, lower mortality, and lower healthcare costs. But also very important, and I think it became very obvious with Russia's war of aggression in Ukraine and the energy crisis, the EU spends a lot in terms of fossil fuel imports. On average, I think an average year, something around 2.4% of GDP is spent on fossil fuel imports. In 2022, it rose to 4.1% of GDP. And of course, on top of that, we have important fossil fuel subsidies. Just looking at the cost of reducing the fossil fuel imports without looking at the subsidies, what we're proposing would be a saving of 2.8 trillion euros over the period 2031 to 2050. And of course, it's very important in terms of protecting our companies and people against future shocks in international fossil fuel prices. It's important for business opportunities, it's important for job opportunities, for example, in the bioeconomy, for example, for circular economy, for production of green technologies. And of course, it's important in terms of lowering the economic costs of climate change. The communication is clear that there are a number of essential enabling conditions to reach that 2040 target. First, essential is that we fully implement the agreed 2030 framework and that we reduce our emissions as much as possible before 2030, because that reduces our greenhouse gas budget and leaves us more flexibility and the world more flexibility. It's important also that we have safeguard the competitiveness of European industry and agriculture. And that means, of course, a level playing field with international partners. And if we are front-loading action in the first decade, we also need greater focus on a just transition to ensure that we leave no one behind. It's very important in terms of achieving the transition. The transition is for people, but it's also about, involves people taking the steps necessary. And so for acceptance and for a successful transition, this is essential. And then this is about an open dialogue on the post-2030 framework. And this is very much where we're at the moment. We're talking about the target, but it's very soon leading into the future, ensuring that the policies we have in place allow us to meet it. The communication so covers the framework needed to meet the target. It doesn't go into the detail of the policies, but it covers what it means for major sectors and enabling environment. So first of all, as I said, the member states are now updating the NECPs, the National Energy and Climate Plans. And this is a really important opportunity to ensure that the EU can deliver on the 2030 target. But then in terms of the development of the post-2030 framework and the broader policy framework, there are sections which I won't go into detail on because we don't have time, but the detail what it means in terms of a just transition and an economy that delivers for people. So it's about the just transition, it's about using climate policy to reduce the impact, so increase more solidarity within our society. It's also about what a good targeting of our policies. It's also about skills, the skills needed for the transition. And then we go on to the EU's energy system. I'll discuss a little bit more detail on what it means for industry, and that the Green Deal should now become an industrial decarbonisation deal. It's about transport and improving mobility. It's about not just agriculture, but more broadly the land, food and bioeconomy sectors, and agriculture's role within that, of course, but the wider decisions that take place in those sectors, and about a comprehensive investment agenda. So we know in terms of an economy that delivers for people that the most vulnerable people are those most exposed to climate change impacts. And we know also that our policies can help reduce poverty and inequalities. And in the impact assessment, there's some interesting assessment of how the use of money from the emissions trading system can be used not just to address distributional impacts from the ETS, but to go beyond that in terms of improving the situation for the poorest households. It's also about recognizing the different impacts by regions and sectors, and addressing those regions where there are sectors that are going to be most exposed to the transition. It's about addressing energy and transport poverty. It's about investing in the skills needed for the labour market transition, but also some targeted income support. It's also about making good use of the cohesion policy going forward, It's funds like the Just Transition Fund, amongst others, but also the well-targeted use of the money coming through the ETS1 and ETS2, and in particular, in this case, from ETS2, the Social Climate Fund. And it's about social dialogue, effective social dialogue, and talking to our social partners, which is happening also at the moment. On the energy sector, it's clear in terms of the sectors, all sectors need to contribute, but of course the energy sector has a very important role to play, and the power sector will be the first to decarbonize and will be fully decarbonized by 2040. And this is electrification and energy efficiency basically drive decarbonization. Renewables become the backbone of the EU's energy system, and addressing the infrastructure needs for that is really crucial. But at the same time, we know that we need all low carbon energy solutions, and you can see the distribution of solutions, the different energy sources for the different options assessed here on the left. But it means also beyond renewables, energy efficiency, CCS, storage, but also nuclear. As I said, the industrial decarbonization deal is essential for competitiveness of the EU economy. In the short term, industry needs stable and affordable clean energy, and that's a focus now as well as for the long term. And so we know we need to pay specific attention now to energy-intensive industries. We also need to create the right enabling framework to mobilize private capital and investment, because we know that public resources, there's a huge demand for public resources, and we need to target those public resources at the technologies which need public investment and ensure that we have private capital coming in for technologies which are more proven. And for that, we need to make best use of all the measures we have. We need to ensure attractive incentives for investment in clean technology manufacturing so that the EU retains its industrial capacity. The circular economy and the bioeconomy will really play a much greater role, also in terms of resource savings and material efficiency, and there with the opportunities for growth and jobs. And we know that we will need carbon removals, and we have a growing need to focus now on industrial carbon management and carbon removals. And there is also a communication on industrial carbon management, which was issued at the same time as the communication on the 2040 target. In terms of land, food and bioeconomy, we recognise that farmers, but also foresters, provide vital services to society, to the economy, but also in terms of the environment. So in terms of healthy food and food security, but there's also growing demand for bio-based materials and for bioenergy. And so this is a sector where sustainable approaches are essential. Also because we rely on the land in terms of environmental services, in terms of water, in terms of resilience, but also, of course, in terms of the natural sink and absorbing CO2 from the atmosphere. We know also that farmers and foresters are at the front line of the climate hazards in terms of droughts and water scarcity, heat waves, fires, but also storms and floods. And we know also that there is a potential for emissions reduction in the agricultural sector, and there's potential to move faster and to enhance carbon removals, but it needs an effective policy framework and incentives across the food value chain, but also the development of new areas of opportunity. So in terms of carbon farming, but also the technologies which help farmers have a more efficient production to save costs at the same time as benefiting the climate and the environment. And of course, it's about a whole of food sector approach, making good use of the CAP and sustainable practices, and we have a strategic dialogue. And I will move faster because I know it's limited time.
Yes, sorry, Vicky. I need you to wrap it up in the next couple of minutes, if possible. Thank you.
Yes, no problem. So in the impact assessment, we look at the investment needs. There's a lot of detail in the impact assessment, but I'm not presenting here, but the investment needs are important. They are important investment needs, but I wanted to show you what this means in practice. So in 2011 to 2020, we had a very low investment decade, and we know that we need to boost investment in the EU economy for our productivity and for our competitiveness generally. And what you see with the scenarios we've been looking at in terms of 2040 is that all require an increase in investment. It's true also for the Fit for 55. But what you can see is that with the target that we're looking at, we have a higher level of investment in the first decade, but it goes below other scenarios for the second decade. And in terms of the increase in investment needed, we're talking about, it's a difference between 3 and 3.5%. So it's around 35-40 billion euros difference between the different scenarios. So not a huge difference. So this is investment which is achievable, but of course we need to make sure it's there for the sectors in the economy. We also looked at some sensitivity going beyond our supply side modelling to look at demand side modelling, a life scenario which looked at lifestyles and circular economy and a bigger push on those areas. And what that shows is that if those sorts of policies can be introduced, then we can really reduce the investment needs to reach the same target. And so working, as I said, with people, with sectors is really important. And of course, the 2040 targets, as I said before, is about creating the regulatory certainty to attract the investment. That's really important. And to make sure that we focus on the bottlenecks in the energy system, such as grids, flexible demand and storage. On mobilizing investments, just to say that there's a lot of discussion around this at the moment. I wanted to put it here. It's about targeting public support. It's also about making good use of the ETS revenues. It's about 1.5 trillion in the rough estimate of the funding that can come via the ETS between 2031 and 2050 through the revenues to member states and at EU level. We need to make sure that member states have the fiscal space to enable public investment. I won't go into more of that. We looked at 8 different building blocks. Again, they're in the communication. They're in the areas which have been mentioned already. And just to conclude, this is about securing the future prosperity and well-being for current and future generations. And it's about being competitive and resilient to climate hazards, but also geopolitical risks. At the same time as freeing ourselves of critical dependencies and not having new critical dependencies. We need the enabling conditions, the debate is starting, and it's about demonstrating our determination to stay at the forefront of the clean tech revolution for our industrial base, but it's also a very important signal to the rest of the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And now we go on to Mr. Naidu. He's currently the head of the African Climate Risk and Human Security Program at the Institute for Security Studies. And we know that the nexus between security and climate is increasingly important. Simultaneously, he's the head of climate adaptation at the South Africa Presidential Climate Commission, who's recently in 2022 presented the Just Transition Framework for South Africa. He's president of the global NGO Human Right to Water, founding member of Water Policy Group. He's a member of the board of the International Water Management Institute, member of SIGAI, vice chair of the UAE Technical Advisory Group on Water. He's also a member of the advisory group of the University of Stellenbosch School of Climate Studies, and he was previously CEO of Water Research Commission, amongst many other things, and many other important positions. Mr. Naidu is going to talk to us about achieving an NDC. As some of you probably know, in 2016, South Africa presented its first NDC. It updated its NDC in 2021 with a goal of reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 31%. It also presented its first adaptation communication detailing South Africa's contribution to the global goal on adaptation. Interesting and important also for Spain because we have a very broad strategy program and innovation in procedural and substantive governance. The NDC in South Africa addresses just transition, focusing on several sectors, which include agricultural, forestry, other land use, energy, industrial processes, product use, and waste sectors. So without further ado, Mr. Naidu, thank you ever so much for joining us. Oh, we can't hear you.
All right. I managed to unmute. All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for an invitation to join you. And given the last presentation, there is so much to react to, but let me try and stick to my brief as you've given it to me, and maybe add inside that some of the things that maybe Europe needs to think about around the way it rolls out its strategy and what the implications are going to be for other parts of the world. And in turn, I think will be quite determinate around Europe's own ability to meet those targets that are put out. So I've spared you a PowerPoint presentation on a Friday afternoon, and I'm going to talk quite generically around some of these issues. I really want to make 4 points, actually. The first of those points is that engaging the NDC requirement for 2025 finds ourselves in a time in the world that is vastly different from 5 years ago. And I think we must talk about those differences as well, because I think they have a direct impact into how those communications come out in the current context. But it has huge implications for some of the ambitions that we have already expressed in the agreements, and beyond the agreements in the voluntary coalitions that we have combined around the world. I mean, one of the big factors between then and now has been the escalation of the war in the Ukraine, and this has already been a matter of global concern, a European war of global concern.
Estamos hablando de una preocupación global.
By Gaza. And Gaza, in many ways, has become a world war, not in the classical physical sense, but certainly the division in the world right now has not seen this kind of stark binary differentiation of the world for a very long time. And I think this is a factor around both the trajectory as well as the speed of transition to lower carbon economies all over the world. In the short term, the escalation of the greenhouse gas emissions, driven primarily by the machinery of war, is a factor, but it's done something else that is critically important. The other thing that it's done is it's taken a lot of the momentum and certainly the focus away from a climate dialogue that was clearly dominant 5 years ago. And the security first paradigm that most countries are adopting right now have become very stark. The pro-military paradigm has become very stark. The movement of expenditure into the military industry complex is directly depriving finances available for climate action. And then in addition to that, all of the aid support programs that were counted on very strongly to enable an already almost 1.5 degree world to be able to deal with the vagaries of climate change has also shifted. But the big thing that I think is going to affect the next NDC is that we have a very vocal and newly empowered fossil fuel sector all over the world. And they're using very strong influences on government in order to engage that agenda. And South Africa is an example of that. And I'll expand on that just a little bit just now. The second point I want to make is that we often don't recognize the NDC as being a very important political instrument. I think we have recognized before that it's an instrument of dialogue around development, but with the differentiation of views and the strengthening and polarization of views around how we move forward, we are beginning to recognize the NDC as a political instrument. And I think it's really, really important and actually forward-thinking for Spain to engage this issue at a political level. And parliamentarians engaging this robustly becomes critically important, because that eventually is going to be the core determinant, not only of the finalization of the NDCs, but what happens to them after they're registered with the UNFCCC in as far as implementation is concerned. This is a factor that is global. We see that on a daily basis. This is a very big factor inside Africa. So the NDC has become one of the new instruments of political discussion on the African continent around our own trajectory as a continent towards development. And we're already talking about the inappropriateness of Agenda 2063 in order to engage this, because Agenda 2063 was relying very largely on that $10 trillion or so of fossil fuel asset that's on the African continent. And now switching from that to a 2063 2.0, if you like, the low carbon version has to navigate all of the obstacles in the road around that engagement, including the dilemma of actually sacrificing this $10 trillion asset on the African continent. At a national level, in South Africa itself, this process has begun in earnest, because like everyone else in the world, we have a very consultative process associated with the development of our NDC. And one of the key instruments that is playing itself out is the energy policy. And our IRP, as we call it, the Integrated Resource Plan around the energy mix, is in vibrant discussion. In fact, it has become one of the factors associated with the political campaigns. And you know, we had an election just yesterday, and we're starting to count out those results. So it is a seriously political animal, and the quicker we cotton on to that will allow us to make better use of what is, in fact, an incredibly important instrument. And a big part of that is around what NDC means around national development policy. Now, Vicky just now went into a little bit of detail. I'm sure she wanted a lot more time to expand on some of those issues. But the whole idea around visualizing and shaping the industrial machinery that constitutes a low carbon economy is critically important, especially in an environment where many of the value chains and many of the environmentally supporting instruments, including banking and finance, are largely engineered around the algorithms that were most useful for a high carbon economy. So the switches around that just transition are very extensive and very, very wide-reaching. And this issue around what constitutes the national development policy is also part of the political character of the NDC, and in fact, the whole of the climate discussion. The second point I want to raise about that is, and I've been in many European discussions, because Europe is the EU in particular, Europe in general, and various European countries, and of course Spain, are very close partners to South Africa and to the African continent as a whole around our own dialogue around climate change issues and various other issues as well. But one of the things that is clearly a point of great concern is that the European discussions around the European project towards low carbon neutrality, towards that 2050 neutrality target, doesn't sufficiently encompass a broader global discussion. Now, you've seen the indicators of some of those things as a severe problem already. I mean, CBAMs has become a global discussion. It has seeded many older discussions around the unfair relationships that exist between the developed world and the developing world. But there's also an issue of sustainability, because climate change is one of those games that only works when all of the players win. If all of the players don't win, then unlike many other games, nobody wins. So I would like to impress upon the colleagues sitting on that side of the world that a deeper consideration around the impacts of not taking all of the world with you on this journey can only be negative in the long run. And if it's not globally negative, then what it certainly will do is to deepen the inequalities that exist already inside the global south. That you will have a climate resilient class of people inside the global south that will do reasonably well. And then you will have a larger population that is ostracized from a more developed part of the global economic trajectory. And this is a matter of really serious concern. But let me talk a little bit more about South Africa and the Presidential Climate Commission in the couple of minutes that I have left, to talk about some of the practical ways in which we are engaging this at a national level. And we certainly have a global outlook in the way we're engaging these issues, because in many ways, what exists between Europe and its neighborhood of partnership in the global south also exists for South Africa and its partnerships in the countries around us, in Africa in particular, but the developing world as a whole. So the PCC, which will become a statutory instrument, well, of course, it depends on the discretion of the new administration, naturally, but it appears that most people support this sufficiently for a climate act to be passed. It has already passed the muster of 2 houses of parliament, and it's waiting its final processes. But before that, we continue to be, as the PCC, a non-statutory body, and there are some advantages to that, actually. One is that the most important thing the PCC has done to date is to organize to have a combined vision around a low-carbon, equitable, prosperous society in South Africa, in a way that individual parts of government or individual sectors could not. So this whole notion of having an entity which is essentially a social compact, a partnership of the major social partners in the societal fabric, has served its purpose just by being formed. And we've been getting lots of dividend from that. The second is because of its standing, it's able to navigate the traditional conflicts that, for example, exist between those parts of government and those parts of society that drive industrialization on the one hand, and those that drive the conservation agenda on the other. And we've built some very important bridges around that. And this desire to have greater and greater convergence around the fundamental issues is what is at play. And I think the achievement index is pretty reasonable for an institution that's only been around for 2 years. So what are those? Well, the first of those is, in fact, the NDC 2021. Its draft through the conventional processes of government landed at point X. And we managed through the PCC to bring those very same partners together again, but combined that with a higher injection of science and evidence into that discussion, and then landed upon a much more ambitious NDC, the thing that is officially the NDC 2021 of South Africa. And on the back of that, and on the back of the confidence gained from that gesture, we managed to garner some very important global partnerships around how to take forward our transition, in particular our energy transition as the front block. But behind that front block of the energy transition is the overall just adaptation and resilience transition of the system as a whole. The second thing that I think is critically important as an achievement platform is the just transition framework. So we embedded now as policy in South Africa a just transition framework built on 3 fundamental principles, 3 fundamental justices. The first is procedural justice, and this you will know quite well, around consultation processes and bringing people on board in a very meaningful way. But the second is very important and not often in other policies, and that's distributive justice. That the gains of the low-carbon economy must be shared among the different layers of society in a reasonable enough way. I mean, equity is the target. We may not get to the equity, but we will have it in a reasonable kind of way, which is quite contrary to our economic development to date, which has been reasonable, but for a few rather than the many. And the third very ambitious justice that we have embedded is restorative justice. We come from a very unequal society. We come from an apartheid society, and that was preceded by colonization. So we want to use the just transition to a low carbon economy project as a principal instrument of the restoration of justice for the equalization, not just politically of our society, but economically as well. The next thing that I think we have been able to achieve is organizing to build bridges around some artificially constrained constructs. So we have very separate discussions, even in the climate domain, around the adaptation enterprise and the mitigation enterprise. And one of the things that the PCC has been successful about doing is gelling that into a joint conversation around climate resilience and the overall ambition of the just transition. But included in that is also the discussions around finance, public and private, and developing our new instruments inside the system, and the economic diversification that is absolutely critical for a high carbon economy like South Africa in the way it transitions to a low carbon economy one. Absolutely critical, because the collateral damage that is possible from closing down the high carbon economy, in particular, coal-based energy systems, which supply more than 80% of the energy needs of South Africans currently, is a critical factor in the way that we're able to do that. So that economic diversification in the short term serves the needs of the immediate big moves in the transition. But like the rest of the world, we are incredibly worried about whether or not we have the right kinds of skills base and the right kind of value chain constructs and institutional arrangements for a low carbon economy. So this economic diversification and skills development mechanisms that are currently at work in the PCC are the precursor to much bigger programs. And if you like, a complete overhaul of some parts of our skilling system, and certainly will change the structure of the South African economy going forward into the system. And then the last part that has been introduced that has already shown some dividends is the issues associated with the new M&E frameworks associated with both investments as well as the regimes associated with things like taxes associated with this transition from a high carbon economy to a low carbon economy. Chair, there's much more to be said, but I must be respectful of your time. So I think maybe I round up here and look forward to bringing up some of those other points inside the discussion. I thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Maidu. I know we're a bit short of time. ¿Tenemos tiempo para quizá unas preguntas? Sí. Pues 5 minutos para preguntas.
We may have time for a few questions, so 5 minutes for a Q&A.
The mic.
I'd like to raise the question of the international dimension of the European Green Deal, which is controversial, as we have just heard, and especially the international dimension of the carbon pricing, which the representative of the Commission talked about. The Fit for 55 package has increased the ambition of the climate action and the prices of carbon pricing in the European Union. So there is a risk of a kind of dumping from other parts of the world, and that some European companies go to other parts of the world with lower carbon prices to become more competitive. So the CBAM that was just mentioned tries to address this carbon leakage problem, and also tries to incentivize that other parts of the world put the same level of carbon pricing and for the same sectors. I would like to ask, especially to the representative of the Commission, how does she think about the creation of carbon clubs between among countries, and linking the trading systems in different countries like Canada, or well, many countries are thinking about after the CBAM of creating a trading systems like China, India, and even the United States considering the creation of a kind of CBAM, but well, it's in a very early stage at this moment. And what do you think also about the establishment of a minimal global carbon price internationally or for regions? Thank you.
Thank you. So market-based instruments, carbon dating, as Luca Taschini from the London School of Economics used to call it. Any other questions from the floor before we wrap up? Okay. Vicky, I'm not sure whether you can hear us.
I can hear you. I can't put my camera back on, but I can hear you. It's just because I think that it was switched off at the host level, but I am here. I've been listening carefully, and thank you very much for this. You know, it was very interesting, and thanks a lot for the very good question. I think what matters, well, carbon pricing has been very effective in terms of creating the incentive economy-wide to get the action we need. It's also been very effective. So, and in particular, the emissions trading system has the bigger advantage of guaranteeing an environmental outcome where you have a cap. But through the trade, it's creating flexibility. So there's a lot of flexibility for companies, and it's made it much more efficient because we have that flexibility there. It's also generated very important revenue, which has been really important in terms of both promoting innovation, but helping those member states or some sectors where there's a need for that extra investment to make the transition cheaper. And it will be really important for ETS too in terms of addressing social aspects. And the volumes of revenue we're talking about are very important. You know, the Social Climate Fund will be bigger in terms of volume than the Just Transition Fund. So it's not insignificant. So I think what matters, whether it's Carbon Club via the Carbon Markets Task Force and working with other countries, is that in particular large emitters put in place carbon pricing systems that work. Because it helps us meet the Paris Agreement's targets. It does it at a low admin costs. It has also advantages in bringing everybody together behind the system. I know it's not easy to talk about increasing the price on something that hasn't been priced sufficiently, but at the same time, it's important in terms of that structural change to recognize that needs to be priced and to see the broader benefits of the system. And I know there are discussions about carbon clubs. There are also, we work very closely. We have, one of the reasons I ended up for 5 years in China is we have a very long-standing cooperation on emissions trading with China, who were looking to what the rest of the world was doing and used the experience to learn to develop their own system. In terms of minimum carbon prices around the world, NDCs are nationally determined contributions because of questions of sovereignty, because of they work, basically. It works in terms of engaging governments to take the action necessary. Minimum prices, if not agreed, if they don't come from bottom up, are complicated. And so, I mean, in the EU, we have some linking of ETS, which basically creates the same price across systems. What we need to ensure, so what we're doing by the CBAM is ensuring that we don't get the leakage, but also that we're creating the incentives, as you said, because it ensures that goods that come onto the European market face the same price. And so it's really for any company that's importing to the EU to face the common incentive. I just think that while minimum carbon prices are great ideas, we have to have practical ways to create the incentive and to make it work. And I think that works with cooperation. And I think that's why we have the Carbon Market Task Force now. It's really, we've worked with some partners around the world more intensively. Now it gives us the extra resource to be more present for others, to bring in money, so resources to support contractors and someone who can do work, but also to support a very straightforward and honest sharing of expertise in terms of what works, what doesn't, why it works in one particular jurisdiction and not in another, and to really help people move faster ahead. And I think really the question is the buy-in, getting the buy-in to make it happen. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Please join me in a round of applause for our speakers. Thank you so much.
Pues ya estamos llegando a la finalización de esta conferencia y quiero hacer unas breves conclusiones porque ya vamos.
We are coming to the end of our conference, and I just want to do some final conclusions before the President of the Commission for Ecological Transition and Demographic Challenge closes this event. It has been made clear after this intense debate how important the role of science is in the battle against climate change. And that is why it is so necessary to have advisory bodies, scientific advisory bodies. This is so crucial. In fact, in our Spanish climate change and ecological and energy transition law, Article 37 creates an expert panel committee on energy transition and climate change. And I think this is one of the few provisions inside this framework law or act that has yet to be developed, because Article 37 said that this would have to be developed through a royal decree, whereas I believe that because the European law on climate change advises the member states to have these bodies, it would be convenient for us to be able to implement that body here in our country, in Spain. And at the time, we issued some recommendations that I don't have time to go over right now. But at the same time, it has also become clear and apparent that the role of science is influential in political decision-making, and that has been shown in this final session, where we have heard about how work is being done based on all of this scientific knowledge. And in addition to the science, I want to highlight the fact that we need to take other measures, and this has been mentioned by the representative of the Danish committee and the French committee. We need to overcome this gap with the agricultural sector and take urgent measures. But when we take measures, I want to underpin the fact that we focused on science, but there are other disciplines. And our last speaker really did highlight the importance of having capacity in other sectors of society, because I think the role of economists is also essential, as is the role of engineers in implementing these measures. And of course, I am definitely not going to leave out lawmakers, because they are important too. And of course, there has to be communication. We've talked about fake news and misinformation. And as a society as a whole, we need the capability for all disciplines to work together to create robust institutions and bodies, which, as we have heard once again today, are so important in the application of these measures. And when the implementation fails, and when there are shortfalls or pitfalls in these institutions, the rule of law allows us to sometimes turn to perhaps legal bodies. And as we have seen over the past decade, the citizenship will often go to the courts to try and drive climate action. And with that, I think we can conclude, and we will have to get together again to talk about the role of the economic sector, the role of law, because they also have a role to play in the battle against climate change. Thank you very much, and I will now give the floor to Cristina Narbona. Thank you very much, everyone. Thanks to all of our speakers. I think the communication that has taken place has been very thorough, very broad about the situation we are in at the moment, where we stand in terms of the participation of the scientific community in decision-making in different countries. And as the director of the International Institute of Law and the Environment recently said, there is a provision in the climate change law that has yet to be grounded or specified, but that does not mean that the Spanish government is not already working on and has in fact already been working with the scientific community for a long time, with the various representatives of Spain on the IPCC. There is an ongoing dialogue there, and I think that all of the decisions that are being made are indeed grounded upon what the scientific community has to say. I just wanted to add a few things specifically from the point of view of how to move forward more quickly, because everything suggests that we are lagging behind, that things are taking too long, and that the effects of the climate change are in fact becoming real much faster than the scientific community believed a few years ago. And in order to be faster, science has to create more awareness. It has to foster citizen participation in changing production and consumer patterns, because climate change isn't something that can be tackled from technology alone. There are evident examples and references on how we will be unable to decarbonize economic activities worldwide, globally, if we only change dirty, let's say, technologies for clean technologies. We're really going to have to make an extraordinary effort in reducing energy consumption, in raw material consumption and critical raw materials particularly, because otherwise we will always worsen our ecological footprint as humankind, and we will increase inequalities at the whole planet level. We have to bear in mind that climate change is, above all, a huge ethical challenge, globally speaking, and climate change is something that we have produced in the more developed countries, and yet what we say, which is now the global south, is the place where we are seeing the most severe effects, because in many countries the institutions
de catástrofes, de fenómenos meteorológicos extremos. Por lo tanto, desde una visión ética, creo que desde la Unión Europea, desde todos los países de la Unión Europea, tenemos que dar una respuesta que signifique hacer frente a este desafío de acuerdo con nuestras responsabilidades y con nuestras capacidades. Y eso supone hacer un enorme esfuerzo.
We have to make a huge effort that we will only manage to bring to fruition if each and every citizen is sufficiently aware of what their own actions and consumer patterns entail. And I think the experience that we have had here in Spain is very relevant in developing the climate change and energy transition law, because we had the participation of many citizens through the so-called Citizen Assembly, Climate Change Citizen Assembly, with over 100 people and a series of enablers who worked hard to analyze and put forward over 100 proposals with which to develop the climate change policy in our country. Those people who were part of the Citizen Assembly for climate are still very much active, and they are willing to collaborate in what I think is a crucial task, which is to vascularize every corner of Spain, to reach every single nook and cranny in a positive way in order to change our production and consumption patterns beyond just a technological change. Climate change has become more and more significant on the political agenda, and I can say this with conviction because ever since 1993, I had my first responsibility as Secretary of the Environment. And since then, and up until now, climate change has gradually turned into a priority on the political agenda. And yet I am extremely concerned about some of the topics that have been raised today, such as denial, negationism against climate change, and the foreseeable results of the European elections. And I'm particularly concerned about the fact that the European Commission is receiving messages that mean, in my opinion, that there is a somewhat less belligerent attitude towards climate change than there was 5 years ago. We are now about to experience the elections, the parliamentary elections, and this was the case also 5 years ago. And it was clear at the time that those who were going to shape the European Union, the European Parliament, saw the Green Deal as an opportunity for progress and as an absolute priority to ensure that Europe becomes the first climate neutral continent. However, if we see the document that has been subjected to appraisal by the leaders in terms of the priority forecasts for the next European Commission, we have seen that there are three main priorities: defense policy, the defense of the rule of law, and economic competitiveness. So where is the Green Deal? It's somewhere within the development of that third priority, which is economic competitiveness. And so moving forward with the Green Deal will indeed contribute, is seen as something that will contribute to improving Europe's economic competitiveness. But without doubt, I think we have taken steps back, as has become clear after all of the protests by the farmers, and there has been a considerable delay in the application of some of the core concerns on the Green Deal, such as reducing nitrate contaminants. In addition to climate change, we have other challenges, and they are all interlinked: the loss of biodiversity, contamination, and climate change is part of something so much bigger, of these planetary limits that have been studied in great depth by the International Institute of Stockholm for Resilience, and the holistic approach of the 2030 Agenda includes this. However, all of this is now being put into question by a significant portion of our society, by those who believe that all of this goes against progress and the interests of well-being. So now is a particularly crucial time, and that is why I am so grateful for Ana Barreira, who is working at the spearhead of the International Institute for Law and the Environment, for organizing this event. This event has allowed us to exchange know-how, expertise, experience given to us by some very qualified professionals. And I hope that each of us now, will be able to take that know-how home and use it to activate other citizens, other authorities, organizations, because we need to move forward much more quickly with the knowledge of what is happening and with the perspective that the scientific community can offer us. Thank you so much, and I hope you have enjoyed this, being welcomed by the House of Words, which is the Congress of Deputies. Thank you.